Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyid al-Anbiya wal-Mursaleen wa ba'd. How's everybody doing? Good rest? Good breakfast? Ready? Energized? Inshallah. We have a long session today, a few hours, and the material may be somewhat dense. So I hope everybody can remain focused and benefit from the class. You know, when classes tend to sway more to the technical side, often people like to check out because they wonder, you know what, just give me the straightforward answer, yes, no, I don't want to know the specifics. But, you know, some of you and many of the people I interact with, y'all are so educated, so qualified, your credentials are, just amazing in the secular field. And I feel it shouldn't be too difficult to translate those skills into the Islamic field. It's like, sometimes I'll bump into somebody who's like the head of the neurology department in like Harvard, and then I'm trying to speak to him about like a basic masala of tahara, and he's like, please, just tell me yes or no. And I think to myself, I'm like, subhanallah, it's not that we don't have the qualifications or the potential, it's just, do we have the willpower and interest? Again, just a few quick caveats before we begin. We're going to start with a few hadith, just to begin on a spiritual note, and inshallah we'll try to end with some hadith as well, so that we can tie everything back to our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the ultimate objective for everything that we do. The second thing is, fiqh by its very nature is legal. It's legalese, as we say. Like if you ever read a legal document, it sometimes reads awkwardly. If anybody's read any legal document, whatever it may be, it just has this really weird, like clause A in reference to 3B, section 4C, and you're reading this, and person A, it's very detached. It doesn't have a very emotional component to it. And I just give this caveat for anyone in general reading Islamic law, that just remember it's a legal document, it's a manual, and if it comes across as somewhat dry or not fully detached, but somewhat detached from what I may find to be normal, it's not reflective of the author himself. It's just the way that people are forced to write. If you put emotions into law, you can't express the law as clearly as you want. This is a general introductory point you should bear in mind whenever you study Islamic law, that if you're reading the laws of marriage, the laws of inheritance, the laws of buyu' transaction, and you find it to be very, it comes across as very surgical, it comes across as very mechanical, that's by its very nature, and that's how law is. If you insert any emotions into law, it may sway the correct direction of what you're trying to say. The scholars themselves may be the best human beings, but they're forced to speak like that. The reason I give this caveat is we may come across some masail, some rulings, not that they're unsettling, you may be wondering, like, could he not have worded it a bit differently? Well, for the sake of precision, he has to do that for law, and it'll make more sense when I talk about it. There are a few other points that I think that need to be clarified, but I'll do that as we get to the main text. But for right now, let's go ahead and start with some hadith so that, we start off on a good note, inshallah. I'm going to start with hadith number 4. It's a hadith that really sticks out for me, and it's something I always try to bear in mind. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: من أفطر يوما من رمضان من غير رخصة ولا مرض لم يقضه عنه صوم الدهر كله وإن صامه رواه أبو داود. He says over here, on the authority of Abu Hurairah رضي الله تعالى عنه, that من أفطر يوما من رمضان من غير رخصة ولا مرض, anyone who intentionally breaks fast during Ramadan without an allowance or illness, not even continuous daily fasting can make it up. There's a beautiful hadith, which is a hadith Qudsi, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us that a person comes close to Allah, the closest a person can come to Allah is through those things that are fard. And once they've accomplished those things that are fard, they can fill in the gaps with those things that are nafal. And once you do the actions that are nafal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I become the eyes through which you see, the hand with which you grab, the feet with which you walk. The reason this hadith is so important is because it highlights to us where our priorities should lie. Islam is, as we were speaking about last night, yes, transactional in terms of our side of things, but ultimately it's the mercy of Allah that gets us into paradise. However, given that our side of things is somewhat transactional, we do things so that we can earn reward, so that we can be compensated, we have to remember the priority and the hierarchy of what we do. Whenever we do something, we should always remember that what Allah has mandated upon us is the most important and the closest way to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this hadith reminds us that if you deliberately leave out fasting in Ramadan without any excuse, without any sickness, you can fast your entire life and you cannot recap, you cannot regain that reward. This is a general principle that we should use whenever we think about our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, praying Fajr Salah is understandably difficult for many of us. If we have early work schedules, we have late night work to catch up, we oftentimes may miss Fajr Salah because, waking up at 5 o'clock, 5:30, depending on what time Fajr is, it can be very difficult. And then trying to get back to sleep before going to work can be difficult. But the 2 rak'at of Fajr that I pray is more beloved in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than anything else I do for the rest of the day. I can just go around and, give charity for a noble cause, go help out in the community, attend some halaqah, listen to a 4-hour lecture, give some motivational lectures on TikTok or whatever I feel is a good way to contribute back to the community. Now, all of that is beautiful, but the 2 rak'at, even though it could have taken me 5 minutes, is so beloved in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I can give, community lectures or, drive, like homeless food drives. All of these things are great. But in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ultimately the thing that gets me closest to Him is the actions that are fard upon us. And that's why I quoted the hadith earlier on, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that once you do the fard actions, everything else is that final, like that cherry on top, is that final few percentage so that you get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our teacher used to give us this example. He's like, imagine a person has a job, it's 9 to 5, and he gets hired, day one he's supposed to show up at work, and he decides not to come. All right, fine. He doesn't show up day one, he doesn't show up the second day, the third day, the fourth, he doesn't show up for an entire week. And then the following week, he shows up after hours and he starts cleaning the windows. And then he starts mopping the floors. He starts sweeping the front yard. He does all of these extra things. And then when the boss meets him and he says, where were you for the whole week? He says, oh, by the way, I cleaned up. I washed the doors. I swept the floors. I mopped the floors. I did all of this. Most likely, he's not only going to get fired, the boss is going to question this dude's sanity. He's like, you had something to do. Why were you so busy with something that's so irrelevant? And as amusing as this example or analogy may be, it really speaks volumes to what we do ourselves oftentimes, where we lose sight of some of the most essential things from our fard salah, right? Like praying dhuhr on time, praying jumu'ah. 2 hours zakah. Sometimes we're trying to find loopholes with our zakah. Like, okay, what can I do to save like $5 over here, $10 over here? I think sometime in the past, I owed this person like $500, so let me just proportionally decrease my zakah. You know what? I think I'm in debt. I'm a student. I'm this. I'm that. And we're trying to cut corners. But then, like 3 weeks later, when there's like an appeal for something that's not related to my zakah, I feel generous enough to support, which is beautiful, which is great, but I've missed out on the real opportunity to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Same thing with Hajj. This is very true, where I think to myself, man, Hajj is going to cost me $15,000 or $20,000 or whatever the price is, but then I'm going to go for Umrah every single year. Right? That's great. MashaAllah, going for Umrah is great. But it's more rewarding for me to save that money, and if I have it, save it towards my Hajj, because that's what's fard on me. When people talk about Islam being difficult, the reason is we oftentimes don't have our priorities straight. We're so fixated on the minutiae, we're so fixated on the secondary, more recommended acts, that we end up putting it in place of the mandatory acts, and we think to ourselves, wow, it's so difficult. Like, I have to be doing this, I have to be doing that. No, what we have to be doing is basically the 5 pillars, and putting aside Islam, it's actually just 4 pillars. Iman, after Iman we have 4 pillars, and it's really not that difficult. And that's what the hadith reminds us, Man aftara yawman min Ramadan min ghayri rukhsatin wala maradin lam yaqdihi anhu sawmu dahri kullu, or kulli. You say kullu if you're connecting it to sawm, and kulli if you're connecting it to ad-dahr, but you connect it to dahr, it's more clear grammatically. Kullihi wa in samahu, even if he fasts his entire life, he's not getting that reward back. It's not happening. That's something we need to be conscious of. Okay, the next hadith that I want to do is hadith number 7 on the following page. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال يقول الله عز وجل الصوم لي وأنا أجزي به يدع شهوته وأكله وشربه من أجلي والصوم جنة وللصائم فرحتان فرحة حين يفطر وفرحة حين يلقى ربه ولا خلوف فم الصائم أطيب عند الله من ريح المسك. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. Now, when a hadith is quoted from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we call that a hadith qudsi. What differentiates a hadith qudsi from the Quran? A few things. Number one, a hadith qudsi is from Allah in terms of meaning, not in terms of wording. In terms of meaning, not in terms of wording. What does that mean? The words, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. This is the kalam, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas the words, As-sawmu li wa ana ajzi bihi, these words are the Prophet alayhi salam's own devised phrasing. He chose this phrasing, but the meaning was revealed to him through Allah. Now, obviously one may ask, isn't everything revealed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What makes hadith qudsi different? The difference is, everything is revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, oftentimes in generalities, and then the Prophet ﷺ, he explains it how he feels comfortable. But a hadith qudsi, the exact meaning is revealed to him, and then he chooses to use certain wordings to describe it. It's kind of like anybody who, most of you guys must be into coding. It's kind of like if you take like a code, and then you choose to represent it in a particular way, that's like a hadith qudsi. Whereas general revelation, everything the Prophet ﷺ says, it's either he says it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts a stamp of approval on it, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him permission to elaborate from his own side. So there's a subtle difference between the two. I know this is not a session on hadith, so I don't want to delve too much into that. But just for our purposes, it's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals a concept to the Prophet ﷺ, and then the Prophet ﷺ takes that and he translates it in his own words. Whereas the Quran is exactly the words from Allah. Yes?
So how would you know through hadith that it's a qudsi rather than revelation?
Because he would say, the Prophet ﷺ would say, يَقُولُ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَ. So the Prophet ﷺ himself says, Allah said the following.
And when it was revelation?
He would just speak himself. Yeah. Or he would say, he wouldn't say it was revealed to me. He would say, oh Muslims, here is what you meant to do. Here is what you are instructed to do. So the hadith is, As-sawmu li. As-sawmu li, fasting is for me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ascribes it to himself. Your fast is going to specifically be overseen by me. As-sawmu li. Wa ana ajzi bihi. And I will personally reward you for it. The words wa ana ajzi bihi is interesting because the vowling of this can go two ways. It can either be وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ, I will reward. And some scholars suggest وَأَنَا أُجْزَى بِهِ, I am the reward for it. So وَأَنَا أَجْزِي means I will reward. Ujiza in the passive tense is I am the reward for it. You know how we were talking about earning the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Depending on how you vowel it, it talks about the different levels of compensation. Either you're fasting, وَأَنَا أَجِزِي بِهِ, you'll be rewarded for your fasting. Or ultimately, وَأَنَا أُجِزَى بِهِ, the compensation is Allah Himself, meaning you've earned the happiness of Allah. My teacher would remind me of this story. They say about the Ghaznavid ruler, Mahmud al-Ghaznawi. The Ghaznavids were a dynasty in, well, Islamic centuries would be the 500. So we're talking about the 1100s of the Common Era. So the Ghaznavids, the Mahmud al-Ghaznawi, who was their general or who was in charge, he had this really close worker general, Ayaz, they used to call him. He's a very close worker, to the point that there were a number of like proverbs and parables made between the connection between Mahmud and Ayaz. So they say Ayaz was a very, very witty, intelligent advisor. And one day when Mahmud al-Ghaznawi felt generous, he told the people of his, locality, his empire, that today I'm going to open the doors of my palace for 10 minutes. And if you enter inside, whatever you touch, you can keep it. Whatever you touch, you can keep it. So they made the announcement, everybody's excited, kind of like Black Friday, everybody's waiting in front of Best Buy. When the doors open, everybody's going to rush inside. So early morning, everybody's waiting by the doors of the palace. And when the clock hits that point, the guards open the door, everyone rushes inside. One person's grabbing a chair, somebody's grabbing the carpet, somebody finds some loose coins, somebody grabs some artifacts, and people are grabbing whatever they can. And there's like a minute left when Mahmud Ghaznawi, the king, he surveys the room and he notices every single person's grabbing something and leaving except his close confidant, Ayaz. He's just standing over there. And he says to Ayaz, like, I know we're close, but don't you want to grab something? He's like, don't worry about it, I still got a few seconds. And as the clock is ticking, it's like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and he just touches Mahmud. And then he looks at him and he's like, that was a good one. He's like, technically I own you now because you said anything you touch belongs to the person who touches it. And forget about just like a carpet or a rug, or I technically own your entire kingdom. Whether it's a real story or whether he ended up giving himself to Ayaz or not is irrelevant. But what's interesting about this is وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ versus وَأَنَا أُجْزَى بِهِ. Do I want to be compensated by Allah, or do I want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's happiness to be the compensation for my fasting? So, وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ and وَأَنَا أُجْزَى بِهِ. Why is it that fasting becomes such a, it's something so close to Allah? If you look at the ahadith, the way Allah talks about the reward for fasting is unparalleled. He talks about Hajj, he talks about fasting, for prayer, zakat. These are all important. But what's interesting is, generally when Hajj is spoken about, you find the emphasis more on, if you don't do Hajj, this is what happens. Like, it's so important, you should not leave it out. Prayer, the difference between somebody who's a Muslim and a non-Muslim is prayer. You can always see these actions being juxtaposed with what the repercussions are for not doing it. There are rewards for it, definitely. But when you look at fasting, there's a greater emphasis on the other side of compensation. And it's so emphasized, so descriptive, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنَا أُجْزَى بِهِ, that I am the reward for it. Now, why is it that Allah is so happy with the action of fasting? He says over here, يَدَعُ شَهْوَتَهُ وَأَكْلَهُ وَشُرْبَهُ مِنْ أَجْلِ. This individual, restrains their desires, avoids eating and drinking, min ajli, solely for me. Because when it comes to prayer, it's a very short action. Like I just have to pray and I'm done. When I go for Hajj, it's just once in my life. When I give zakah, once in a year. But fasting 30 days consecutively, when nobody's looking, I can just quickly drink something, I can eat something. So the added amount of ikhlas and sincerity in fasting is unparalleled. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala greatly appreciates that. And He says after that, وَالصَّوْمُ جُنَّةٌ. Fasting is a shield. It protects you from a number of sins. It makes you more conscious of your identity as a Muslim. I mean, think about the number of times where you're fasting and you want to do something, and then you're reminded that you're fasting, and you're like, you know what, I can't. Like in a hadith, it comes, if you're arguing with somebody, just say, إِنِّي مْرُؤٌ صَائِمٌ. I'm fasting, I just don't want to entertain this argument right now. Please, I just can't have it. You're right, I'm wrong, let's just call it a day. So, وَالصَّوْمُ جُنَّةٌ. It protects you, but the thing about the shield that you get from fasting, it's not just like a shield you have and it's done. Because habits, to build a habit, it takes about 30 to 40 days. Any habit, 30 to 40 days. Some people say 40 days it takes you to build a habit. That's why you have the 6 days of Shawwal fasting to increase the fasting, and it increases. But nonetheless, you have the month of Ramadan, and when you do it consecutively, you develop this habit of being mindful of what you eat, being mindful of what you drink, and being mindful of your already lawful intimate connection with your spouse. So that when the month is done, you're able to avoid those things that are clearly unlawful. It's like you go through the ringer, you go through the difficulty, so that when you're out of the month of Ramadan, things are much easier. And then the Prophet ﷺ says, وَلِلصَّائِمِ فَرْحَتَانِ وَلِلصَّائِمِ فَرْحَتَانِ. The one who fasts will have 2 moments of happiness. فَرْحَةٌ حِينَ يُفْطِرُ وَفَرْحَةٌ حِينَ يَلْقَى رَبَّهُ. He'll be happy when he breaks his fast, somewhat for worldly reasons, in the sense that, okay, I'm breaking my fast, now I can sustain and nourish myself. And فَرْحَةٌ عِنْدَ يَلْقَى رَبَّهُ. And that happiness when he meets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's really interesting if you compare the two. It's so fascinating because it's like a micro level of happiness and a macro level of happiness. You have the day of fasting, and then you have the moment of breaking fasting. That's reflected in a life of fasting, and then seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like breaking your fast from a lifelong imsak and abstinence from the pleasures of the world. When I think about it this way, it's just like the Prophet ﷺ telling us, there's a micro happiness that you will experience every day. I'm fasting, I'm starving, I'm exhausted, I'm thirsty. I sit down, I'm looking at the food in front of me, mouth's watering, and I'm just waiting for that adhan to be called or that clock to tick so I can take that morsel of food or drink. You feel nourished, you feel happy, and you feel like it was all worth it in the end. Right? You're like, man, I was so tempted to eat, I was so tempted to drink, but I did not, I withheld, I stayed back. But now when I'm eating at it, I enjoy it so much more. I remember when I was young, and it was like the first or second time I was ever fasting in my life. I think I was like 12 years old. I was going to Islamic school, and I was on the bus coming home, and it was my first day fasting, and it was like 2 o'clock. And my friend, he wasn't fasting, but he pulled out a Hershey's bar, and I thought to myself, I'm like, man, this is difficult. I can't take a bite from his chocolate bar. And then he's like, man, just do it. And I thought to myself, I'm 12 years old. I can fast when I get a bit older. So I took a bite of that Hershey bar, and I broke my fast. And I felt so guilty for the rest of the day. So I didn't tell anybody. I kind of like confessing right now, but my parents didn't know at the time. And then we're all like we're just about to break fast, and I'm looking at my family. Everybody's been fasting, hopefully, unless they've been having Hershey bars like secretly as well. But everybody's been fasting, and it's time to eat. And as everybody's eating, I'm eating too, but I don't feel that fulfillment because I felt like I'm cheating. I thought to myself, I'm like, subhanAllah, I didn't really fast, because that moment of weakness, that lapse in my resilience, I ended up eating something. And then the next time I fasted, I made sure that there's no way I'm going to break my fast, even if somebody offers me anything. And then when it was a time of iftar, and I broke my fast, I just felt this sense of relief, this sense of accomplishment, that every second of sabr and patience that I went through in that day was so worth it. So that's on a micro level. Farhatun inda fitrihi. When you break your fast. Inda fitrihi can refer to two things. It can either refer to on a day-to-day when you're breaking your fast, or it can be fitr when the month comes to an end and it's Eid al-Fitr. When it's Eid al-Fitr, now you're enjoying, it's like, you're still like hesitating, like, it feels awkward that I can drink, can I not, it's in the morning. But then you realize, subhanAllah, you earn this one day of happiness, enjoyment, and spending time with the family. And then on the macro level, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. My whole life I've been, very perseverant, I've been very patient with my desires and my wants and what I'm doing, and then the angels will come to greet me, and they will say to me, أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. It's time to meet your Lord. All your sacrifices were worth it in the end. And that's the second farha, that's on a macro level and eternal. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among them. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. These are just a few ahadith to get us going, to understand the virtues of the month of Ramadan, and in particular fasting. Fasting, as we'll cover in the next chapter, is not limited to the month of Ramadan. Sometimes we forget that there are other types of fasting, there are other days of fasting, like the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, some other contested days like Nisf Sha'ban. We can talk about those, the 6 days of Shawwal. The idea here is there are many opportunities for us to fast, and I think inculcating a healthy, schedule of fasting occasionally. Like for instance, the Prophet ﷺ would fast on Mondays and Thursdays. Ayyamul Bid, the 3 days of the month fasting. It really gives us a sense of truly feeling the objectives of Ramadan. Because the thing is, fasting in Ramadan is great, but when the month comes to an end, it like quickly dissipates. That feeling that I had, it becomes like the best analogy for me. It reminds me of the pandemic. During those few months of quarantine, it felt like it was an apocalyptic phase. Like the world is coming to an end. I'm locked up inside of my room in my house. I can't go out. Whenever I touch something, I'm using like some sanitization. I'm wearing gloves. I'm not touching the bags. I'm going to Kroger with like a mask on and a hazmat suit or whatever. Like I'm so careful about everything that I'm touching that my existence has changed. Fast forward like 1 year, it's this far off dream. It's like, did I just wake up from a nightmare? It never happened. And the only thing that reminds me that it ever happened is when I walk into the masjid, I see the sign that says 6 feet distance. And I'm wondering like, what does that refer to? Once upon a time, there was this thing called 6 feet of a distance. And fasting is no different. After like fasting for a month, we really feel charged, we're conscious, we're everything. But then 2 months later, it's like, wow, I actually didn't eat and drink the whole day, but the vestiges of it just don't remain. So fasting throughout the rest of the year occasionally would really help to sustain that spark that I've developed during the month of Ramadan. And even if it's just once a month or once every 2 months, it could go a long way in, retaining the value of Ramadan. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Any questions before we move on to the next chapter? It seems like it's talking about generally the ahadith that speak about fasting, unless stated otherwise, are in reference to Ramadan. But you can derive a broader lesson from this hadith that it refers to fasting in general, but generally it refers to specific, it's Ramadan, yeah. Okay. So there are a few hadith left. If I get a chance, once we're done, I want to come back to the hadith, so we end off with hadith. But for the sake of time constraints, we can move on to the third chapter, starting with the types of fasting. But I'm just going to give you some quick introductory points to bear in mind as we read this. All right. This text, which spans 18 pages, The following 18 pages are taken from a text, a classical fiqh text known as Mukhtasar al-Quduri. The word Mukhtasar refers to an epitome, a summary. Al-Quduri is the name of a scholar. He was a scholar in 5th century Baghdad. Again, I use the term 5th century in reference to 500 years after the Prophet ﷺ. He was a scholar in Baghdad, and he wrote this Mukhtasar, a summary of fiqh, for just the general public to benefit and understand the Fiqh of Ramadan. Now, we touched upon this in the introduction, that fiqh by its very nature is, we can say, flexible. It lends itself to disagreement in the furu', which we spoke about last night. The secondary issues, by its very nature, given the ranking of evidence, given the clarity of the evidence, people will arrive at different conclusions. That's very important to bear in mind, because for the sake of convenience, we're going to be presenting the Fiqh of Ramadan from a consistent paradigm, from one school, just so that we're not hopping and jumping around. It's to present fiqh in a way that's consistent. This is not saying that anything outside of these next 20 pages or 18 pages is wrong. If you've been practicing on something, or if your local scholar tells you something, understand that it's not necessarily wrong, it's just a different opinion on it. We're covering one consistent approach, and if you follow it completely, that's great. But if there are certain specifics that you've learned differently, I can try and address that to see whether it actually is an opinion or it's just something floating around that we happen to be doing. So this is predominantly based on a Hanafi fiqh approach to it, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And honestly speaking, majority of this overlaps with the other schools as well. It's not like every single specific is different. I would say 95% of it is the same as other schools. There's just a few issues, and I may just draw attention to those here and there so that you're aware of it. The reason I mention this is because it may happen that you read this, you internalize it, and then you go home and maybe your mom or your dad or a relative tends to be practicing a bit different, and you're saying like, okay, what you're doing is wrong. I just learned this in a 2-day course that I attended over the weekend. It could be that both are right. Again, these are secondary issues, nothing to be too concerned about. The third thing that I want to mention is, if you look at it, it's divided into Arabic text on the right and translation on the left. Okay? When you read this, it may read very technical. It may read very, for all of you, you may be used to this already, where translations don't read as smooth as original English pieces. Anybody growing up, we've read a lot of English translations. They read a bit awkward. It's like some translations are so archaic, like doeth, thoueth, thee. It's not going to be that archaic, but just bear in mind that it's still a translation in the end of the day. So I'll do my best to convey the meaning that's being intended by the author. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a legal text. So it's meant to be as, I like to use the term surgical. It's meant to be as emotionless as possible, just so that we can understand. The emotions, or the more emotional side to this, is meant to be inserted by the scholar or the person reading it. And you just fill in the blanks, all right? You'll understand what I'm talking about as we go through it. So this is a section from Mukhtasar al-Quduri of the famous scholar of Baghdad, al-Quduri, Ahmad al-Quduri, from the 400s. With that, inshallah, we'll go ahead. There's two parts to this. The first is a somewhat comprehensive overview of the chapter of fasting. Yeah, so there's two parts to this. The first is just a comprehensive overview of fasting. What are the types of fasting? How do we establish the month of Ramadan? What can you not do? Who is excused? All of that. And then after that, we have a short section on the basic principles of what breaks your fast in terms of medicine and food and all of that. A general seminar, or a general masjid presentation, let's put it that way, on fasting tends to be very straightforward and easy. You'll have the khatib or the imam come, they'll have slides, and then they'll say, okay, this is what you can do, this is what you cannot do. The way we're going to do it is a notch above in terms of its intensity and difficulty, because we're not getting a summarized version of it, we're reading from the text directly. So understand how this is, like if you look at the journey of knowledge, we have the general khutbahs, the general inspirational talks, the general workshops in Ramadan. The fact that we're using the original text is kind of a bit ahead in that journey. The intensity is a bit more, which is really great, and we get a taste of what the journey of traditional Islamic learning looks like. With that said, each section has its own header or chapter heading to summarize what we're going to be discussing, like the types of fasting, establishing when Ramadan begins. Inshallah, what we will do is I'll have somebody read the English, and the relevant parts from the Arabic, I'll point them out. Okay? Okay, so to begin, the types of fasting. The first thing often discussed in the books of fiqh is the word used for fasting is called sawm. Sawm. What does sawm mean? Sawm linguistically and technically has different definitions. Linguistically, it refers to just imsak. If you open up the dictionary and you look at the word sawm, what does it mean? Imsak, to hold back, to abstain in general. From a linguistic perspective, it's very general. From the Shari'i perspective, it refers to avoiding certain things in the month of not in the month of Ramadan, during a specific time. Avoiding certain things during a specific time. And the author will come back to that definition later on. The second thing that's interesting is when you read the books of fiqh, you will see that they're organized in the following sequence. First, they talk about purification. Then they talk about salah. Then they talk about zakah. And then they talk about sawm. Why do they follow this sequence? It's because this is the sequence that the Prophet ﷺ chose when he spoke about these matters. And there's a logical consistency to it as well, in the sense that purification leads to proper prayer. Prayer happens on a daily basis. Zakah is something that's a one-off on a yearly basis, and then fasting is on a yearly basis for an entire month. So there's also like a logical sequence to it. So the author begins by talking about the different types of fasting. He says in Arabic, as-sawmu darban, wajibun wa naflun. There are two types of fasting, obligatory and optional. So the word obligatory or wajib, as I've described last night, would refer to a subcategory of fard, right? We spoke about fard and wajib. The fard being the primary category and wajib being the secondary category. Here he's not referring to that technical distinction. Over here, wajib is used synonymously to the word fard. Basically, he's saying there are two types of fasting. Either something that you have to do, whether it's fard or wajib, or it's something that's recommended to do. It can be sunnah, it can be nafal, it can be just mubah. So it comprises all of the categories. So don't think of it being two types, meaning, okay, if there are two types, what's the difference between fasting on a random Wednesday versus fasting during Ayyamul Bid? One is nafal and one is sunnah. And then you have fasting in Ramadan. Shouldn't there be multiple categories? There are multiple categories, but he takes this bird's eye view of saying the fasting is either necessary in the broader sense or recommended in the broader sense. Under necessary, it can either be wajib or fard, and under optional, it can be nafal, sunnah, mubah. Is that clear? So he starts off by saying fasting is obligatory or optional in the broader sense of the definition. And then he says the obligatory fast is of two types. Go ahead.
With the intention
Okay, after providing a categorization, a broad categorization of fasting, he then tells us regarding intentions of fasting. When do I need to make my intention before fasting? So first, let's understand the two types of fasting. It's either necessary or it is recommended. When it is necessary, this fasting can be of two types. When it's necessary, there are two types. Certain types of fast that I need to make an intention the night before, but as long as I make intention before midday, it is fine. The second type is I have to make an intention before the fasting begins. These are two different types. The first one is the fasting of Ramadan and a specified vow that I make. I'll give examples of all of these in a moment. And the second is making up Ramadan. Is this going to be happening every hour? Okay, we can use this as a reminder for we need to take a break, but it's fine. And the second type is making up Ramadan, a general vow, and kaffarah. Okay. So, if you're going to look at the chart from a very broad perspective, you have fasting as a general category. Then it's either necessary or it is recommended. That which is necessary has two categories. The first category refers to two types of fasting. Fasting in Ramadan or a specific vow. The second category is three types. Making up Ramadan, an unspecified vow, or a kaffarah. Now, if this is already too overwhelming for you, we're trying to figure out what Ramadan is, why all these categories, don't worry about it. I'm not going to get into each of them, but it's just helpful to understand the various categories. Now, when you look at yes?
What was the third one?
The third one is kaffarah. I'll explain that in a moment, kaffarah. The reason this is important, because it helps us know how much time do I have in order to make intention before I begin my fast. So, tomorrow I want to fast. And I think to myself, all right, tomorrow I am fasting. I already made an intention. Therefore, my fast for tomorrow counts. But what happens if I wake up in the morning and it's like 7 a.m., it's past Fajr time, I'm not too hungry, and I realize, you know what, I just might as well just fast today since we're going to have a very big dinner at night. Can I make an intention at that moment and it will count towards the rest of my day for fasting? Well, it depends on the type of fasting that I have. Is it from category 1A or category 1B, or is it category 2? Category 1A, 1B, or 2, which is recommended. Depending on where it falls, I can either make the intention for my fasting or I'm not allowed to make the intention for fasting. In the case of category 1A, what is 1A? It's necessary and it refers to Ramadan and a specified vow. You don't have to worry too much about a specified vow, but what it basically means is I say, Ya Allah, if such and such thing happens in my life, I will fast on this day. It's very specific. Ya Allah, if I pass my exams, I will fast on the 10th of January. Very specific. That's what you call a specific vow. In that case, as well in Ramadan, I am allowed to make intention from the time of sunset, until midday of the next day. Which means, let's say it's the second day of Ramadan and I'm going to fast tomorrow, I need to make intention that I am fasting tomorrow. Now, when do I make that intention? From the time of sunset until the next day, midday, I'm allowed to make that intention. So, if I think to myself, you know what, I'm going to be traveling tomorrow, so I don't want to fast. I make the intention that I'm not going to fast. I wake up in the morning, It's 7 a.m., it's 8 a.m., I look at my phone and my flight just got canceled. I'm like, all right, you know what? I don't want to travel anymore because my flight's canceled. I'm staying back, but I want to remake my intention to fast in the month of Ramadan. Can I do that? And the answer is yes, I can do that because it's category 1A. Category 1A, you are allowed to fast and make your intention until midday. Now, when is midday? The simple way of understanding midday is if you take the time of fast beginning, the beginning of fast, not sunrise, when the fasting begins, because the fasting begins when sahur ends. When does sahur end? The beginning of fajr time. And then you take sunset and you mark right in the middle, that is midday from the Shari'i perspective. So if you start the day at, if let's say fajr time sets in at 3:30 a.m., right? 3:30 a.m. and that's when fajr in certain place like UK or somewhere, you'll have it at 3:30 a.m. and it carries on all the way to 8:30. Let's say a fasting day is that long. In certain places in the world, it is that long. So 3:30 is when my sahur time ends. 8:30 p.m. is when I break my fast. What's right in the middle of that? Right in the middle of that is 12 a.m. Right? Because it's 17 hours, I break it in half, and it's 12 a.m. I have to make my intention before 12 a.m. If I have a flight, PM. 12 p.m. If I don't make my intention before 12 p.m., then that day's fasting is gone. Yeah.
Very quick. So, is there like a point that you also have to not have had any food or drink?
Yeah, I'll get to that right now. Now, you can't have a hefty breakfast and then say, you know what? I'm not hungry anymore, so I might as well just fast the rest of the day. No, this means you have done nothing that would break your fast already. Yeah.
Sheikh, this question comes up. So imagine someone woke up on the day of Ramadan and around, let's say, 10 a.m. There's just that fact that fasting crossed their mind. Is that enough for the intentionality?
Yeah. So the obvious next question is, what does it mean to make intention for fasting? The intention for fasting does not have to be verbalized. Just the thought crosses your mind that I am fasting tomorrow, that's enough. That's enough. You just have to think to yourself that I'm fasting. All right? Is that clear? Then you don't have to worry too much about the vow. I don't want to confuse you all right now. Now let's go to 1B. 1B is the most important is Qada of Ramadan, making up the fast of Ramadan, at least for our purposes. So let's say in Ramadan I was traveling, or for whatever reason I had an illness, I couldn't fast. Now I think to myself that next week I'm going to make up those 3-4 days that I couldn't fast. On the Monday that I want to fast, I wake up at like 10 a.m. and I'm like, you know what? I don't really feel hungry today. I'm going to fast. But wait, why make a normal nafil fast when I can complete my make-up qada fast from the month of Ramadan? You cannot do that. For a qada fast, you need to make intention before your fasting begins. So if you wake up in that morning, you can't just make that intention anymore. It needs to be very specific. It has to be done before you begin your fast in order for it to count towards your qada. Is that clear? That's 1B. Yes.
I don't want to get too far off of it. In terms of the intention of
Yeah.
doing it ahead of time, is that something that we can be like, okay, well, Ramadan is coming up, I can make the intention today that I intend to fast for every day of Ramadan, or is that something that
No.
has to be done
The night before, you need to be conscious of the fact that you're fasting the next day. When does this become tricky? And again, since you asked, that's why I'm going to go down this rabbit hole. It's what happens when you're not sure if the next day is the first day of Eid or is the last day of Ramadan, or if the next day is the first day of Ramadan or the last day of Sha'ban. That's when it gets tricky because you're not sure if you're fasting or not fasting. That's when this whole discussion is very relevant for that time. Because I can't just say, I make intention for the entire month. What is the entire month? Is it 29 days or is it 30 days? So you have to take every night separately. Yes?
So I have a question.
Sure.
So if
No. If you're feeling uncomfortable or you're feeling sick, you're allowed to break your fast.
Or if you're like just tired.
We're going to cover that shortly. It depends on how tired you are. If you're tired in a way that it impacts your fast, then you shouldn't break, you are allowed to break your fast. But if you're tired in the sense that it's just slightly inconvenient, you should not break your fast. And it also depends, we have a section on traveling. It depends on when you began your travel. No problem. Okay, so section 1B is when you're going to make up a fasting of Ramadan. And then you have section or type 2. Type 2 is just nafil fasting, recommended fasting. The section on recommended fasting is very broad, whether it's sunnah, whether it's mustahab, whether it's mubah. What's an example of sunnah? The 3 days in the month, ayyamul bid, or fasting on Mondays and Thursdays, or fasting the 6 days of Shawwal, or it's just a general nafil fast. I just want to fast. Mubah, just want to fast. All these other categories, you're allowed to make intention before midday. So if I just wake up some random day and I said, you know what, I want to fast a voluntary fast today, I can do so as long as I've done nothing against my fasting and it's before midday. Is that clear? Okay. Again, I don't want to make this too technical, but hopefully this summarizes just overall the types that we have. Yes?
Can you just for clarity define midday one more time?
So the way we think about midday, you either look at midday from just a worldly perspective or midday from an Islamic perspective. Midday from a worldly perspective is from sunrise to sunset, straight in the middle. From the Islamic perspective, it's from the time of Fajr, which is about like an hour or two before, until sunset, and you look at the middle. The idea here, do you understand that? So if you start your fasting at 3:30 a.m., and then you break your fast at 8:30 p.m., then 12 p.m. is when you're allowed to make intention. After that, you're not. Now you may ask, why is this time so relevant? It's relevant because you want your intention to be present for most of your fasting. And if you do it before that midday point, more than 50% of your fasting is accompanied with the correct intention. The moment you pass midday, from a Shari'i perspective, less than 50% of your fasting is accompanied by an intention. Yes?
So I heard people refer to the day before Dhuhr prayer.
That's true. In terms of prayer, that's true. You call that zawal. So that midday is what we call midday nisfun nahar in general. For the purposes of fasting, midday is just slightly different. It's because, think about the rationale behind this. The idea is you need intention for most of your fasting. Your fasting doesn't begin with sunrise. It begins with the time of Fajr. So you're going to calculate it slightly different.
I just want to clarify for myself. So basically, for obligatory, there's two types. For optional, there's one type.
Yeah.
And that one type for optional
It's the same as
one
1A and 2 is the same.
1A and 2 is the same. The only time you have to make the intention before the fast is if you're making up a fast or
The 1B, basically.
You mentioned, sorry,
Sure.
one last thing on the timing. When it's mentioned that it needs to be done the day before, does that mean the day before after Maghrib?
After Maghrib.
After Maghrib.
After Maghrib. Meaning you can't do it at Asr time because the next day starts at Maghrib. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, are there difference of opinions on this, or are all the members the same? Because maybe I was taught wrong, but I always knew that if you don't make, at least for all of the fasts, if you don't make your intention before Fajr, it doesn't count.
It's true in that applying to 1B for this sake, but 1A you're allowed to make intention until midday. It's possible there's some difference of opinion. I haven't looked too deeply into that. I haven't come across it, but it's possible. Okay, inshallah. Yeah, sure.
You mentioned something about how midday is based off of the Islamic perspective and the world
Yeah.
perspective. I didn't catch the
So when you talk about midday, half of the day, when does the day begin? From like a observable, empirical perspective, the day begins from sunrise until sunset. But you already started fasting from the time of Fajr. So there's like an hour and a half extra that you're going to have to calculate. Because if the rationale is you need intention for more than 50% of the day, your day doesn't begin with sunrise. So for the purposes of dhuhr, yes, you can calculate zawal from sunrise to sunset because you don't need 50% of the day. For your fasting, you need 50%, and that's why they call it nisfun nahar al-shar'i versus nisfun nahar al-mutlaq in Arabic, the difference. Okay? So, okay, that's page 1. We'll count as we're going along to see how we're progressing. We just have 17 more pages to go. Inshallah, we'll be here till 2025, and it'll be nice, inshallah. Actually, I don't mind at all. I'd rather have you guys properly understand the little that we cover than have a surface level understanding of everything. And we're not going to spend too much time with everything because the next one is everyone's favorite topic of moon sighting, right? Like, when does the month of Ramadan begin? How do you establish it? Moon sighting or moon fighting or whatever you want to call it. It's still important. It's something that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he tells us, "Sumu li ru'yatihi wa aftiru li ru'yatihi." Begin and commence your fasting by sighting the moon, and also end your fasting by sighting the moon. Just for a bird's eye perspective on this, so you're aware, generally there are 3 different methods that, at least in the present day, people use for calculating the beginning of Ramadan or anything. And the confusion lends itself to the fact that the lunar calendar is unpredictable. The lunar calendar is unpredictable, unlike the solar calendar. So there are 3 general ways that people like to calculate the beginning of any month, and particularly the month of Ramadan. The first is what we call calculations, where you just use astronomical calculations to determine when, for the next 10 years, it is likely to happen. Whether it happens or not, it may be true. I'll get to that in a moment. The second is called global moon sighting, where you're not going to predict it or calculate it from beforehand. When the month starts, any person in the world, some random village in some other country, if they see it, it's equally binding for the rest of the world. All right, that's the second category. And the third category is called local moon sighting, where you're only bound to take the opinion of somebody within your region, depending on how you define that. Do you guys see the 3 different opinions? If you go from a broad perspective, certain people propose, let's use astronomical calculations. Let's just calculate this, let's make it easy so we can make it a national holiday. You know, we're not going to be sitting there with the board trying to wait till like 1 p.m. when California sees the sighting and say, okay, tomorrow there is no class, or tomorrow there is class. They're not going to have it. So let's do astronomical calculations. The second is global. Okay, you know what? We're not going to go with astronomical calculations, but we're going to make it a global calculation. Anyone sights the moon, then we're perfectly fine with it and we will go with it. The third is very localized, in the sense that if a person sees it, but they're within a very, demarcated region, that's all we will accept, and that's what applies to us. The purpose of this session is not to get into the specifics of moon sighting. I just wanted to make you aware of the different ways that people arrive at the beginning of Ramadan and why it becomes so heated on the night before Ramadan, because depending on which opinion you take, you're going to be very passionate about Ramadan beginning or not. And that's why you see this weird fiasco of like half the congregation starts Taraweeh, the other half doesn't, one half is waiting, and it's just the nature of where we live. And believe it or not, it was never an issue for the vast majority of Muslim history because we didn't live in a global village. Now that we live in a global village, everything gets so complicated because I know of the sighting happening like thousands of miles away. In the past, I'm just in my local village, wherever I am. If the imam goes with it, I will go with it. And I don't need to worry about my cousin in this part of the world or my aunt in that part of the world. Because by the time I find out that they're fasting, they must be already done fasting and the Ramadan's already done, because news doesn't reach that quickly, right? As opposed to now, it's just like, you'll call your uncle in India, your aunt in Morocco, or your friend in Ghana, and like you figure these things out very quickly. Ala kulli hal, he says over here, establishing when Ramadan begins, depending on whichever point that you take, we're just going to read through this quickly because that's why you need counsels. Somebody's testimony about observing the hilal, observing the sighting of the moon is very important because based on that sighting, what we're going to do now is mandate an entire nation to either fast or not fast. So we can't just take, oh, he said, she said that they may have seen something that they heard from their cat. That does not work. You need somebody very specific for this job who meets certain criteria, and you're going to interrogate them until you get the information. You know, sometimes people are very, they lack some understanding on this because they criticize these Sharia boards or these scholarly lejinas, these scholarly bodies where they say, man, this random person told you that they saw the moon, why are you making such an issue out of it? The reason they have to go through this whole process of vetting is because think about what the implications are. If we accept your statement, thousands and thousands of people are either going to be fasting or they're fasting for no reason. So we're going to have to put some protocols in place to ensure that your information is true. So what are those basic guidelines that we can bear in mind when to see the month of Ramadan coming? To give you a quick summary of it, we look at the sighting of the moon for the beginning of the month of Ramadan or the ending of the month of Ramadan. That's the first way. The second is, whether it's the beginning or the ending, we have to see whether it's cloudy outside or the horizon and the skies are clear. Do you understand that? Because if the sky is clear, it's easier for one person to see it. If it's cloudy outside, more people, if it's clear outside, many people have to see it. If it's cloudy outside, maybe one person or two people can see it. Do you understand that? So the basic summary here is when a judge is going to take the opinion from somebody's testimony, he will see, are we establishing the month of Ramadan or are we calling the end of the month of Ramadan, i.e. the beginning of Shawwal. Now, the beginning or ending of the month of Ramadan, when that person saw it, it's either cloudy. If it is cloudy, then if one person sees it, it makes sense why many people didn't see it. Because it's cloudy, people were unable to see it. One person was in a right angle, he was in a right elevation, and he was able to see it. But if the sky is clear, you need multiple people to see it. That's just a basic summary. There are more specifics, inshallah. We'll go through it without spending too much time on it. Carry on.
People should look for the crescent on the 29th day of Sha'ban. If they see it, they begin fasting the next day. But if there is overcast, they complete the 30 days of Sha'ban and then begin fasting.
Yeah, so he begins by saying, people should look for the crescent on the 29th day of Sha'ban. The 29th because there may be a 30th day for Sha'ban and there may not be. Just to remind everybody, FYI, it's Sha'ban, Ramadan and Shawwal. All right? Sha'ban, then the Ramadan, then Shawwal. The on both sides kind of gets confusing which one comes first, which one comes second. But it's Sha'ban, Ramadan, and then Shawwal. The way I kind of remember it is the 6 days of Shawwal that happens after Ramadan. So Shawwal is the third one. The first one is Sha'ban. And then Ramadan is in between. So on the 29th day of Sha'ban, people should go out in search of the crescent, in search of the moon. If they see it, they're going to be fasting the next day. Why? Because they've seen it. Now the month of Ramadan has begun. And if there's an overcast, meaning it's cloudy, it's unclear, then, and they're unable to see it, they should continue fasting. They should continue assuming that the next day is Sha'ban. You have to think about it this way. The next day is either the 30th day of Sha'ban or it's the first day of Ramadan. Why do we consider it the last day of Sha'ban and not the first day of Ramadan? Because both are possible. There's an overcast. I just don't know what it is. Why do we consider it to be the last day of Sha'ban and not the first day of Ramadan? The scholars explain because it's more likely that the month is completed than a new month beginning. Because you're uncertain. Why use that uncertainty for the commencement of a brand new month instead of just continuing what you're already doing? If it turns out that, wait a second, yesterday or today was actually the first day of Ramadan, that's a separate issue, but you're not held accountable for that. Yeah.
So let's say in case of on the 29th day of Shaban, you don't see the crescent, right? And you continue with the month of Shaban for the 30th day. On the 30th day, if you still don't see the moon, then
You have to assume that's the first day of Ramadan. There's no 31st day, yeah.
So I know we talked about it a little bit before, but we can use, for example, astronomical ideas, right? So let's say on the 29th day.
But I didn't say you can. I said it's used. Whether you can or not. My personal opinion is I'm not too comfortable with astronomical sighting. I'm a bigger fan of global sighting. But those who do go with astronomical sighting, yeah. With that as a premise, your question.
Hypothetically, like it is a cloudy day,
Yeah.
but they have instruments to look through the clouds
Yeah.
and actually see.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. Honestly, I don't want to get too into the specifics. There's a question of like, what happens if I just use a telescope? Or what happens if I'm on top of a mountain? And they have different like restrictions of what is acceptable, what is not. And if you have calculations, it doesn't matter. Overcast doesn't matter because you don't need to see the moon anymore. You're already calculating it. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
So for the 30 days, isn't it already mentioned in the hadith like sumuli if you don't see then make it 30 days if it's overcast.
Yeah.
So isn't that you taken from the hadith or is it because of the logical conclusion?
It's both. It's both. It's both because there's a possibility that it's Ramadan. So it's like we take it from the hadith and then we rationalize it. Okay. Yes.
So the Hanafi example for the one that's mentioned by the scholars, do you take the global moon sighting or like the local moon sighting?
Both opinions are found. And it's tricky because what was global in the past is not really what's global today, but the more comfortable and more reasonable opinion for our context, I feel, is global moon sighting. There's a bit of difficulty in that, but it's still easier than local moon sighting. Local moon sighting, at least in the current context, is very difficult to practice on. Okay? By the way, if anyone goes with astronomical moon sighting, I don't think it's an issue per se. I personally don't feel comfortable with it at this point. I can see the pressure and the need for it, so you have consistency and you have predictability, but I guess it's just the way my mind works and more a traditional approach to this that it'll take me some time to get comfortable with it.
You're attacking our community.
Oh, it's your community. Oh, by the way, I have no idea. Okay. If I go missing tomorrow, let's just say this information's gone into the wrong people. I had no clue what you guys are doing, by the way. I thought core community was like a part of a different region and like it's completely unrelated. That's why. Unless you guys have a moon sighting department here within core, it's
But you said it on the record.
alhamdulillah, it's fine. Yeah. Yes.
So in that sort of context, if I was someone that preferred global, but then I live in a community that uses the calculations, is it that I fall?
You always go with what your community does. There's no need. Like I've seen this growing up and how it tears communities apart, where we literally, it's nice for me that you have 3 days of Eid, but one day the person is doing based on calculations, the next day the person does it based on local, and the day after that the person does it based on global. Whatever your masjid is going, as long as it's one of these three. I don't know if they invent a fourth one sometime in the future. I don't know, somehow they use like an AI bot to like figure out what Ramadan is or something. Sorry? Yeah.
I guess a follow-up question
Yeah.
to that then. What happens if you're like traveling?
Yeah.
For Eid? So like I start fasting one day, but then my family's fasting a different day. Do I follow?
As long as you've done 29 days, then you do it. If it's less than 29 days, you're still going to have to fast. Okay. Yeah.
Do you mean still have to fast on the first day of Eid and like the destination time?
Because you haven't completed your fasting yet, right? 28 days, you still have one more day.
Yeah, normally the calculation and global kind of coincide.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Y'all put me in the most awkward position like 5 minutes ago. Forget it. I'm not going to. Let's just carry on.
If the sky is unclear, the imam may accept even a singular upright testimony regarding the crescent, whether it's a man, woman, tree,
So the idea here is when the judge is going to be accepting someone's testimony, it doesn't matter what their gender is, it doesn't matter what their social standing is. You may think, okay, this is obvious, but there's a reason why. There's a difference in the Sharia between shahada and khabar, which basically means a testimony versus information. If I want to make a claim against someone else about something unrelated to the deen, right? He stole my car, or he owes me money, or he did X, Y, and Z. The testimony needs to meet certain criteria, as opposed to just general testimony. For instance, in certain matters, we only accept the testimony of women, we don't accept the testimony of men. In certain cases, we only accept the testimony of men, not the testimony of women. For instance, if it's something related to a female, we're not going to accept the testimony of a male. But because the citing of the Ramadan has nothing to do with gender or social standing, anyone can make that testimony and we will accept it, except for people who are regarded as unreliable. Unreliable meaning the person is an open liar, the person has been caught doing certain things that puts into question his reliability, then we're not going to accept it from him. But the average person, regardless of gender or social standing, we will accept their claim. Carry on.
However, if the sky is clear, a singular testimony is not accepted, but rather a large group of people must record it until it becomes definitively known.
Yeah, as I mentioned, depending on whether it's cloudy or not. If it's cloudy or if there's an overcast, one person mentioning that they saw it is perfectly fine. Because depending on where you are, you may have a better view than other people. But if the sky is clear and only one person sees it, it's highly doubtful that everybody else who went out could not see it except for this one individual. So we're not going to accept their claim. And it gets a bit interesting, and again, I don't mean to make you guys think too hard about this, but what does that person do? Because if he thinks the month of Ramadan began, nobody's accepting his testimony, but he believes that he saw it, what should he do? Let's not get into that. Unless you're that specific person, call me and I'll let you know what to do. All right, mashallah. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil anbiya wal mursaleen, wa ba'd. We finished 2 sections, now we're starting with the 3rd section, which is some of the specifics of fasting. He's going to talk about the definition, he'll talk about certain things that you can and cannot do, after which he will talk about what breaks the fast. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, let's go ahead.
The fast begins from the onset of the second Fajr until the sunset. Definition of fasting.
Okay, so the first is, as I mentioned, what's the duration of fasting? It's from the onset of the second Fajr. Now that sounds a bit tricky. What's the second Fajr? Like we're learning so many things here, like there's a first Fajr, a second Fajr. Basically, if you look at the horizon, at the time of Fajr, there's 2 types of Fajr. One is what they call Subh Kadhib, and the second is Subh Sadiq. There's the false beginning of Fajr and the true beginning of Fajr. As the sun begins to rise, the first thing you'll see is the shooting light that goes vertical. That is not the correct time of Fajr beginning. That's known as the false commencement of Fajr because it's not really the beginning of Fajr, but somebody may assume it's the beginning of Fajr. About half an hour after that, as the sun continues to rise, obviously you didn't see it rise yet, the rays or the initial light goes horizontal. That is known as as-subh as-sadiq, the true Fajr. And that's what's being described here as the Fajr al-Thani, the second Fajr and the true Fajr. So let's assume Fajr time in our example, the fake lighting begins at 3 o'clock. You don't consider that. 3:30 a.m. is where the true Fajr begins. That's when your fasting actually commences. And this carries on until Ghurub al-Shams, sunset. Okay, that's just the duration. Next is the definition.
Definition of fasting is abstinence from eating, drinking, and intercourse during the day with intention.
So here are a few components to it. Number 1, it's abstinence, to avoid. Number one, akal, consumption, eating, drinking, and intercourse during the day with intention. Intention is important. The clause of intention was covered in the previous pages. Regarding abstinence, we'll talk about what that means, and then what types of food, what types of drinks, and when what's meant by intercourse in this context. Yes?
Sorry, going back to the two types of fajr, the Arabic term was subh sadiq, for the false one, and what was
Subh sadiq. Subh sadiq. Okay, that's the definition. Nothing too difficult. Okay, in the next 3 paragraphs, what he will talk about is what happens if you do something that breaks your fast. When will we consider that an invalidation of your fast, and when will we overlook it? This is somewhat jumping the gun again, but to make it simple for everyone here, I want you to think about 2 things. One is how you break your fast, and the second is what happens when the fast breaks. How you break your fast can either be intentional, forgetful, or accidental. Intentional, forgetful, or accidental. Now, there's a difference between forgetful and accidental. When someone breaks their fast forgetfully, or let's say intentionally, it means I have food in front of me, I'm not hungry, I'm like, you know what, I just can't do this anymore, I'm going to eat, I'm going to drink. So I drink something, I don't need it. That's intentionally breaking my fast. Forgetfully breaking my fast is some point in the day, the fast is really getting to me and I completely forgot that I'm actually fasting, and I forgetfully eat. Forgetful in this context means I forget the fact that I am fasting. So I just start eating. Accidental means I realize that I'm fasting. I'm aware of it, but the food or the water accidentally goes into my mouth and I drink it. That's a nice excuse that somebody can make. But an example of that happens is when a person shouldn't be doing this, but they rinse their mouth. When they rinse their mouth just to make it moist, and they accidentally swallow the water. That's an example of accidental. Do you understand these 3 types? Those are 3 ways a person can break their fast. Then on the other side, you have what do you do when you break your fast? There's Qada. Qada refers to making up the fast. And then kaffarah, the complicated term of expiation. You know, it's a really interesting thing my friend was telling me, observation which is really true, my colleague. He was saying that Muslims from a very young age know certain words that the average American has no clue about. Like for instance, the word pious, right? The word pious, we say it from the age of if you're in Islamic school, you use the word pious all the time, but that's actually an SAT word. And that's something people in high school and college don't even know about. Or expiation. I mean, you can go to a professor of English and they won't even know what that means, but some random kid in Islamic school knows what it means because you read it in these translations. Expiation, kaffarah. Basically, if I deliberately break my fast, what do I do as a penalty? So qada simply means to make up the fast, and kaffarah is a penalty that I have to do or give in certain circumstances, which we'll get to, but it's more than just making up that one fast. It's making up the fast plus a penalty. So when you know the 3 causes and the 2 outcomes, to make it simple, if it is done forgetfully, then there is only qada. If something is done forgetfully, I either drink or eat or whatnot, forgetfully, I am forgetting my state of fasting, then there's only qada. I make up that one day, there is no penalty. But if it is intentional, or if it is accidental, intentional or accidental, then there is qada and kaffarah. Qada and kaffarah. I'm so sorry. Let's take a second back. I need to clarify this. Basically, if it's forgetful and I eat it, nothing happens. Nothing happens. Let's take a step back. I'm sorry, I just got distracted for a second. If you take forgetfully, you eat something. I completely forget the state that I'm in. I forget that I'm fasting and I'm eating and I'm eating and I'm eating. There's no qada. You don't have to make up anything. That was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala feeding you and giving you something to drink, right? You understand that? Then the second is accidental. When I accidentally eat something, I just have to do qada. I just have to do qada. Do you understand that? Let's say I'm rinsing my mouth and then the water goes in, and I'm aware I'm fasting, but the water accidentally goes in. My fast is officially broken. Am I saying something wrong? Yeah. Okay. Because usually when I'm in my train of thoughts, I forget that I may be saying something wrong. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, are these conditions all the same for all types of fasting? It's
Yeah, whether it's nafil fast or fard fast, they all apply. The only thing that does not apply, and I'm going to get to that, is kaffarah. Kaffarah is specific to the month of Ramadan. Is that clear? Yeah. I'm just giving an overview. Somebody read the first 2 paragraphs, and we're still going through it. The thing about, like I said, classical texts is when you read them, they don't come across as organized. So it's better for me to give you a basic summary of the chapter, and then we read it.
Just a little bit of clarity. So suppose you've forgotten that you were fasting, and you're in the middle of taking a sip of water, and while you're drinking it, you remember that you're fasting.
Yeah.
Spit it out and things like that, but something still goes in.
Yeah.
Does that fall under the
That's a tricky one. It's inshallah. So the question is, let's say I completely forget, I'm drinking, and midway, my brother comes to me, just throws something at me, he's like, hey man, you're fasting. Now, like that 1 second of something going in, you don't have to worry about that. You're regarded as somebody who's forgetful. Unless after that you continue doing it. But if you stopped at that moment, don't worry too much about the specifics at that point. So, yeah.
For the accidental, so let's say you know you're fasting, you swallowed water by accident, and then is your fasting motto, you go on eat?
So that section's coming in the ending. We're going to talk about what does a person do when their fast breaks. Do they continue fasting for the rest of the day or not? I saw somebody else's hand. Okay, same question. Okay, yes.
Just to make sure, so basically, outside of Ramadan, somebody intentionally breaks their fast. They see food, they know they're fasting, they're just like, let me eat because I'm kind of done. They only do qada, correct?
So there's 2 parts left. I'm not done with I'm going to answer that question right now. So basically, just to answer your question and give a bird's eye view again, you have forgetful, you have accidental and intentional. Forgetful, accidental, intentional. You have nothing, qada, and then kaffarah. If it's forgetful, there's no repercussion. Just carry on the rest of the day fasting as normal, and it counts. If it's accidental, you just do qada. Your fast is nullified. For another day, you have to make up that fast. Then the third is intentional. Intentional has 2 parts to it. Intentional is either with an excuse or without an excuse. If I have an excuse for why I'm intentionally eating, then again, it's only qada. I'm feeling sick, I'm feeling weak, I'm in the middle of a travel and I'm unable to continue. All of these scenarios, I just have to do qada. Which brings us to the last one, 3B, where it's intentional, I have no excuse, I just succumb to my wants and desires and I go and I eat. In that case, there's qada and there's kaffarah. I have to make up that one day, and then there's a penalty which we'll discuss in another chapter. This is specific to the month of Ramadan. I mean, I didn't want to make a 3C as well, and now it'll get complicated, but just there's kaffarah does not apply to outside Ramadan.
Is there a limit to how much food you can eat forgetfully?
No.
I
Yeah.
didn't mean to say that.
Yeah. No, you can continue eating as much as you want.
No,
Seriously, I'm being honest. Like, you can have a whole meal, a whole feast, and it's interesting. It comes in the hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fed you. Consider yourself a guest in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah's table. Right? All right. So where are we at? Okay, so that's just a basic overview. He's going to talk about some of these things. Now, I gave the example of just eating. But obviously, there are 3 things that break the fast: eating, drinking, and intercourse. Now, jokes aside, when we think about the idea of intercourse, there's going to be specifics later on when he talks about this. But what happens, because the word intercourse is still very broad, there are many categories under that. It can refer to somebody being intimate with their spouse, physically intimate with their spouse, but it can also refer to this general emission of fluids. What is that categorized as? So there's some very specifics when you start getting under the category of intercourse, and the author is going to touch upon that. But simply put, the only thing that goes under kaffarah is when a person is fully physical in terms of intercourse with their spouse. Fully physical. Beyond that, anything beneath that does not result in kaffarah. So, and again, I'm saying this because it's a challenge that many people face, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the strength to, whatever bad habits we may have, we do our best to get out of those bad habits and seek Allah's protection. If a person has the bad habit of masturbation, for instance, that kind of falls under the category of intercourse. Now, in the sense that there is a form of ejaculation, does that break the fast? Yes, it breaks the fast, but there's no kaffarah. Kaffarah is limited to a person being physically intimate with their spouse with the full definition of intercourse. Any other form just results in qada and kaffarah. Just be aware of that. Yes.
You said that digesting food is considered breaking your fast. What about if you throw up food?
We have a section on throwing up that's going to come, inshallah. So I just thought I'll give you that introduction as we cover it. He'll also talk about a wet dream. If a person has a wet dream, a nocturnal emission, and there's a wet dream through that, does the person's fasting break or not? And the answer is no, it doesn't break. And he'll get into the specifics here. Yes, you can carry on reading. We're at in the fasting, if the first fasting person.
If the fasting person ate, drank, or had intercourse forgetfully, his fast doesn't break.
So over here, he's talking about any of these things you do under that first category, nothing happens. You just carry on fasting.
Similarly, in the cases of a wet dream, ejaculation simply via gazing at a woman, application of oil to the body, cupping, using antimony, or kissing, the fast does not break.
Yeah, using antimony just refers to kuhl. The reason why some people thought, the reason he's even mentioning this, kuhl on the eyes, the reason he's mentioning this because at some point people assumed that when you put kuhl, the corner of your eye, it may get into the throat. From the corner of the eye, the kuhl may get into the throat. He's like, listen, don't worry about that. It doesn't break your fast. And then he says, kissing over here doesn't break the fast. And the reason for this, and there's some difference of opinion, does it, is it makruh or not? It just depends on if the person's more in control or not. Can a person kiss their spouse? If they're more in control, yes, they say there's some leeway for that. Otherwise, there shouldn't be any leeway. But if these things happen, but there is ejaculation, then in that case, the person has to make up the fast. Yes, you can read that last paragraph.
However, if ejaculation occurs via kissing or touching, then fast breaks and makeup.
Makeup over here refers to qada, specifically qada. Hopefully what I gave as the summary should put everything into perspective in terms of forgetfulness, accidental, and deliberate, nothing, qada, and kaffarah. Now, once we talk about that bird's eye view, page 4 now? We'll count as we go through so we can track our journey. Page 4, okay, so now certain things do break your fast and certain things don't break your fast. When these things happen, does a person do qada or kaffarah? A lot of this that we're discussing will actually be covered in that fourth section. In that fourth section, we're going to cover a very concise definition of what breaks the fast and what doesn't. And I feel that's a very, it's a very useful overview of this entire chapter. But just for the purposes of getting through this section, we can read this. So a few things you'll talk about over here is vomiting, right? To answer Muaz's question, vomiting. The second is he'll talk about what happens when you consume something that's not edible. Is that considered breaking your fast or not? Number 3, what happens when someone does break their fast deliberately? So these are a few things you'll talk about and what the consequences are. You can go ahead and read.
If a person inadvertently vomits, his fast is not broken, but if he deliberately induces vomit which fills his mouth, then qada is due upon him.
So, in terms of vomiting, does it break my fast or not? Simply put, the only time my vomiting breaks my fast is if I induce the vomit and it is mouthful. Basically, I'm feeling queasy and I'm like, you know what? I'm trying to vomit. So I force myself to vomit and it's a mouthful of vomit. That's the only time my fast breaks. All other types of vomit do not break my fast. Now, this may sound a bit uncomfortable, but I'm going to mention this anyway. This is assuming, obviously, the person doesn't take the vomit back inside. Right? Some people, they're trying to hold it in, it's going out, and just put that situation aside. In general, when a person is vomiting, normal vomiting, if it's induced and a mouthful comes out, that breaks your fast, nothing else breaks your fast. Okay? So if it's a small amount, it's a large amount, whether it's induced and it's a small amount, or it's not induced and it's a large amount, none of those situations break your fast. Only if you induce the fast and it's a full a mouthful. In that case, if it does break your fast, you just have to do qada. You just have to make one day up of fasting, not the entire kaffarah. Okay? Carry on.
And whoever swallows a pebble, a piece of metal, or a pit has broken his fast and needs to make it up.
Now, this is interesting, right? This is one of those sections or one of those opinions that have somewhat of a disagreement. What do you do when you consume something that's inedible, right? You swallow a pebble, or for some reason you eat iron. Think you're going to become Iron Man, so let's just eat some iron. So you eat iron, or you swallow a date seed, or something of that, which is not edible. According to the author over here, and I mentioned again, there's some disagreement which we'll cover shortly. Aftara wa qada. According to him, you have broken your fast. You have broken your fast. And since you broke your fast and it's nothing major, you have to do qada of it. You have to make up that one day's fast. There's some disagreement on this, which we'll cover in the next section. And this brings us to the one scenario where there is kaffarah and qada together. That one scenario. What is that scenario? Go ahead.
But whoever either deliberately commits intercourse in either of the two passages or eats or drinks by which nourishment or treatment is achieved, then he has broken his fast, needs to make it up, and must offer expiation, which is the expiation of the
This paragraph exemplifies what I mentioned in the beginning. Legal texts are written in a very compact, surgical way. Somebody reads this and they're like, wait, who talks like this? Like, nobody talks to another person in this straightforward, straight-jacketed, matter-of-fact way. But it's a legal text and the author has to speak like that. Summary is, if a person commits intercourse, whichever way the person commits intercourse, or he eats or drinks deliberately, something that's sustaining, meaning the reason he says something that's sustaining is because if you eat a pebble, it's not sustaining. If you eat iron, it's not sustaining. That just results in a qada. In all these other cases, you have qada and kaffarah. What is kaffarah? Kaffarah is a penalty, an expiation that you have to give. There's different categories, but maybe 60 days of fasting that you have to do. Or you have to feed 60 people. We'll talk about that shortly. Which is the expiation of dhihar. Dhihar, as I mentioned yesterday, is a type of practice that was prevalent in pre-Islamic Arabia, where a person would try to separate from his wife using some awkward phrase. And Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam didn't like that, and he would tell them that, listen, if somebody does make this phrase of dhihar to separate from their wife, and they don't fall through with it, there is a certain type of kaffarah that you have to give. There's a certain type of expiation that you have to give. That expiation is the same for Ramadan. That's why he mentions it here. Again, it's just for students of knowledge to be aware of. But apart from that, kaffarah is generally, for our purposes, either feeding 60 people or fasting 60 consecutive days.
Just to go back to, accidentally swallowing something will break your fast. I feel like, especially
that would fall under this category of your fast being broken.
It would.
And that's why some people say when you're brushing your teeth, the act of brushing your teeth while you're fasting, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's discouraged for that possibility that you may swallow some toothpaste. That's why use a very small amount or use a miswak instead. Yeah.
Would it be the same when making wudu? You just kind of like,
Yeah, same thing. You don't want to rinse your mouth very thoroughly.
you can just do a
Very small amount.
I just want to go back. I understand this is the English translation, so it might be lost in translation, but it says by which nourishment or treatment is achieved.
Medicine.
So if you intentionally, like for a medical condition, need to take like medicine.
Like Tylenol. Tylenol is like not really edible per se, but it's meant for treatment. Then if you take it deliberately with no reason, like you don't, if you need to take the medication because of an illness, which is generally the case, that's perfectly fine. But if a person just wants to take Tylenol or whatnot for whatever reason, then you have to do kaffarah.
Like taking medicine for a headache versus like taking medicine because you have like a genuine medical condition.
Well, even a headache is fine. If like it's preventing my fasting. Like if a headache is really affecting me, that's still an illness, right? Like if I have a severe migraine and I'm not able to continue fasting and I take medication, that breaks my fast, but there's no kaffarah. This is like somebody saying that, oh, I enjoy the taste of Tums. And okay, you know what, I'm just gonna go and pop a few and like, all right, it's nourishment to an extent, it's a medication to an extent, but there's no reason for the person to be taking that.
And then this might be getting into the weeds
Yeah.
too early. What about like IV treatments?
We're gonna get to that. That does not break the fast. Because not only is it nourishment, it has to go through certain passages for it to be considered. Yeah. By the way, I apologize if it's already getting very technical, but that's the purpose of this class. This is not our after Isha, any person comes and shows up and let's talk about the basics of Ramadan. This is assuming we're kicking it up a notch and it's slightly difficult. Honestly, this is like, sometimes a lot of what we're covering is like first year of Qalam or second year of Qalam Institute. This is like the level of discussion that we have. And it's perfectly fine because we're kind of beyond just the Sunday school overview of fasting. We need some of the specifics. Yes?
Sorry, I was just a little bit confused. So, Dhihar is that awkward phrasing of divorce that you were talking about in Sunnah Arabia?
I'm sorry, what? Yeah, the dhihar, yeah. Yeah, dhihar. Basically, a person would, for some odd reason, some people in pre-Islamic Arabia would say to their wives, you are my sister. You are my mother. That's what dhihar is. Now, when they would say that, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam says, you cannot say a word like that and still be in that marriage. So either retract that statement or go through with it and separate. So if a person doesn't retracts that statement, there's an expiation for it. That expiation is fasting 2 consecutive months or feeding 60 people. That's a dhihar, yeah.
Whoever swallows something in that article, is that for intentional and accidental? Like accidental would be like...
Same thing. They're both the same. Yeah. Yeah.
And then one thing is about the expiation. It was mentioned, you fast 60 days or feed 60 people. Is there one that...
Yeah, there is. I'm trying to break the difficult news later.
Okay.
Like it's tough news that you're gonna have to try to fast first before you can't get away with just sending out a check and like feeding some people. You're gonna have to fast first, but we'll get to that inshallah. All right, I think we're done with this section. Was that page 4? Now we're on page 5. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. All right, fast breaking, just miscellaneous issues relating to what also breaks your fast. What he does over here is spell out what we summarized in the beginning. If you remember that basic summary that I told you of forgetful, accidental, intentional, nothing, qada and kaffarah, and you connect them, these past few pages should be well summarized for you. But let's go through the specifics at any rate. All right, carry on.
As for the person who commits intercourse and ejaculates without penetration, then fast breaks and makeup is necessary without menstruation.
Basically, what this person is saying, or what he's saying over here is if someone is intimate with their spouse, but there's not actual penetration, there's not actual intercourse, but there is ejaculation, the person, reaches their climax or whatever, in that case, there is qada, but there's no kaffarah. Just remember, kaffarah is, in the case of intercourse, is very specific to when the actual act of intercourse is happening. So, in that case, there is qada, but there is no kaffarah. This definition applies to all of what I mentioned above. As I mentioned, even though it's a bad habit, if a person does masturbate while they're fasting, there is qada, but there is no kaffarah. Okay? وَلَا كَفَارَةَ عَلَيْهِ. Okay, carry on.
There is no expiation if fast was ruined outside of Ramadan.
Yeah, this is very important. The question of kafara is very specific to Ramadan. However, a person breaks the fast outside of Ramadan, there is no kafara, there is only qada. The concept of kafara is specific to the month of Ramadan. Okay? Carry on.
Tasting something with the mouth does not break the fast, but is just
Yeah, if you taste something, I gave the example last night of somebody who wants to check the sugar, the salt in their food, and they want to see it. Ultimately, it doesn't meet the definition of consuming something because it's such a small amount. But they say it's discouraged, it's makruh. Now, the word makruh, as I mentioned, has two categories. It's either tahrimi or tanzihi. Tahrimi means it's borderline haram. Tanzihi means it is just borderline permissible. Borderline permissible, meaning there's slight dislike over there, but it's still permissible to do. This falls under tanzihi. It's a minor form. Basically, nothing happens because there's a possibility of you tasting a bit too much. Like if your tasting turns into tasting an entire plate, then oh, you know what, I might as well just taste what the rest of the food tastes like. Then yeah, that's going to break your fast, right? So just like the forgetful category, it's just very subjective. So tasting it is disliked, and it could get worse depending on how much you're tasting. All right? Yeah, carry on.
It is discouraged for a woman to chew the food for her child if there is an alternative available to fasting.
Basically, again, disliked over here, don't think of it as anything bad per se. It's just saying what it can potentially lead to. If my child, struggles eating solid food, and I need to, soften it myself, chew on it and give them the food, and I'm fasting, there's a possibility that I'm going to swallow that food. So it's disliked. Again, very minor form of it being disliked. I should try to find other ways of softening the food. If I can do that, that's great, right? So, I notice this all the time. Whenever my wife is feeding the kids, it's like the food is on the spoon, but then you put it through your mouth just so you can have that perfect shape for the child to consume it. Because if it doesn't look properly, if it doesn't look right, the kid's like, nope, I'm not eating it. It's not in the shape of an almond or something. That's the only time I'm going to eat it, right? Parent problems, right? It is what it is. So in that case, if you're fasting, what are you meant to do? Right? So it's fine, but be careful how you do it. Because once you put that spoon of food in your mouth, what are you going to do with it? You're going to spit it out? Then the kid's going to be like, oh, that's a nice idea. I might as well just do it myself. So it's makruh. Try to find other ways to make the food soft. This is just an example. All right, the last one.
The chewing of gum does not break the fast, though it is discouraged.
Okay, remember. They're not talking about Listerine or Big Red or what's the I forgot. I don't chew gum anymore. Trident. They're not talking about flavored gum over here. Gum without flavor. Yeah, I don't know why somebody would chew flavorless gum. Yeah, you can't be. No. Because then you're swallowing something that has flavor in it. All right? Juicy fruit. Yeah, or. What's it called? Big Red? Is that the name? Big Red, right? Yeah. Yeah. Do they still sell those gum packets? Is that even a thing anymore? I don't know. Those 25 cents gum packets, you get 5 sticks. So he says over here, it doesn't break the fast when there is no flavor. Now, the people in the past, why they would chew flavorless gum is it would help them focus. It would help them focus. That's why. It's kind of like somebody who has a habit of keeping a toothpick in their mouth. It's just something that they do. Some people like chewing flavorless gum. That doesn't break the fast. But again, why is it disliked if there's no flavor? Again, you're doing an action that resembles, you can confuse people like, what is this guy doing? You know, like his mouth is constantly moving all day. I thought he's fasting. So it's disliked. And remember, disliked, it's borderline permissible. There's nothing wrong with it. But what it can potentially lead to makes it disliked. Yes?
Similar question. Regarding toothpaste, can we brush our teeth with like toothpaste? Does that?
Yeah, this actually falls under brushing your teeth. There's nothing wrong with it. But the moment you swallow it, it breaks your fast. Does that make sense? So it's perfectly permissible. There's nothing wrong with brushing your teeth. But you'll find most scholars saying don't brush your teeth because if you don't use a small amount, it's likely to be swallowed.
Like even though there's flavor in the toothpaste?
Well, the thing is you're not swallowing anything. You're spitting everything out. The problem with chewing gum is unless you're spitting it out every 2 seconds, at some point you're going to be swallowing that flavor. So if you use a mouthwash but you spit everything out, that's perfectly fine. And that, very small remnants of it, that's not a problem. Yes?
And when it comes to like tasting the food, are you swallowing what you're tasting, or is it like you taste it, the salt, and then you taste it?
So the thing is, it depends on how much you're tasting, right? Like if you can't be taking a spoonful. When they talk about tasting, it's like, you know how you put the spoon there and you just lick the tip of the spoon? That is an example of it. Because it's such a small amount, you're not really consuming anything. But if you take a whole spoon, then you're going to have to spit it out.
In terms of the gum only being flavorless, does that also then include, also needs to be like non-medicated, so like no nicotine gum or anything like that?
We're going to talk about that,
Okay.
yeah. Is nicotine gum flavorless completely? Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes?
Going back to observing Ramadan, say if one person in a land saw the Hida and then in another land they didn't, what is the ruling?
Well, like I said, it depends on your first premise. If in your locality you go with local moon sighting or global moon sighting. If you're going with global moon sighting, the fact that somebody's seen it, the Qadi is going to say, let's begin the fasting. But if you're going with local moon sighting, they'll say, listen, since that person's from another region, we don't worry about what that person says. All right, we're done with page 5? Page 6. All right, we should have a bar or like that's constantly getting, huh? Okay, never mind, we're back at page 4. All right, no, I'm joking. No, go ahead. Yeah, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry.
No.
Out of curiosity, for the mother chewing the food for the kid, would that be tanzihi or tahrihi?
It's tanzihi. Because it all falls on, this is just a more specific example of the previous point that he mentioned about tasting the food.
Could you just give a small example of tahrimi then?
Well, none of this is tahrimi. The example of tahrimi, it depends on how much you're doing. So depending on how tricky it gets, right? So it can be tahrimi if I take a whole spoonful. Tasting is where I just taste it and that's it. If I take a whole spoonful, it will be tahrimi because the likelihood of me not swallowing it is very slim. Right? Yes?
A little bit of good news, Sheikh. There's a page here that's printed twice.
Allahu Akbar. Subhanallah. Does it mean we have to do it twice or we can skip over it? All right. What is this page? What did I say we're at?
5.
Page 5. Now 6. Okay, page 6. Alhamdulillah. Traveling and sickness. I think we'll let your sister read a bit, even though she lost the rock, paper, scissors, shoe thing. You can go ahead and read a little bit, inshallah.
Whoever becomes ill in Ramadan and fears that if he fasts, his illness will intensify, should not fast and make it up.
Okay. In terms of fasting, as when you're fasting, the main 2 reasons why you're allowed to either break your fast or not even start your fast is when you're sick or you're traveling. Now, remember, this is just a random question I need to answer. When you're traveling and you haven't started your fast yet, then you do not have to fast the next day. But let's say, this is where it gets tricky. What happens if my flight is in the middle of the day when I'm fasting? My flight tomorrow to, let's say, Saudi for Umrah is at 2 p.m. and it's Ramadan. What do I do? Am I a traveler or not? Well, technically, I intend to be a traveler, but when the fasting begins, I am not a traveler. So this does not apply to me. You're only a traveler when the fasting hasn't begun and you're traveling. If you're not traveling, you intend to travel in the middle of the day, whether it's work related or whatnot, you haven't begun your fasting. You can't take that license or that excuse if you're not traveling. Yes, if you begin your travel and you're already fasting and you feel uncomfortable, you're allowed to break your fast. But you're going to have to start your fast that day because you're not a traveler technically yet. Is that clear? Okay, that's just one thing I wanted to mention. Now, what he's going to talk about here is starting with the person who is sick. When a person is sick and they fear that their sickness will intensify, they are allowed to break their fast. Now, what does fear of sickness intensifying even mean? Sickness refers to a sickness that prevents you from completing the fast. A person can have a sickness or an illness that does not affect their fast the least bit. So, yeah, there are many examples of that, but if, let's say for instance, I get a cut on my finger and it hurts a lot. Now that doesn't necessarily affect my fasting unless I'm prescribed medication that I need to take for that really bad cut. Do you understand? As opposed to, I have a very bad migraine, I just can't continue fasting, I have to consume something. In that case, that's a type of sickness that means we can break our fast. Determining the intensity of sickness is generally encouraged to get medical advice. Don't self-diagnose. If a doctor says to you that, listen, you should actually break your fast, then yeah, you're allowed to break your fast. There's nothing wrong with that. So, whoever, وَمَنْ كَانَ مَرِيضًا فِي رَمَضَانَ فَخَافَ إِنْ صَامَ زَادَ مَرَضُهُ أَفْطَرَ وَقَضَى. That if you're sick in Ramadan and you're scared and you fear that if you fast, the intensity of your illness will increase, then yeah, just break your fast and just make it up another day. Yeah.
When people experience a common cold, congestion, and so on and so forth, they're encouraged to take liquids. So in that situation, would that be a reason to break the fast?
That's a good question. If I just have a common cold and I'm encouraged, the doctor says, it's good for you to do it, but if you don't do it, there's going to be no harm to you. So, that's a judgment call in the end of the day. If I am sick and the doctor's like, listen, if you're going to fast, your sickness is going to prolong for weeks on end, I suggest that you break your fast, then you can take that suggestion. That's why the fuqaha and the scholars, they say go to a Muslim doctor who understands the circumstances more. Don't just go to an average doctor, a non-Muslim doctor, because for them it's hard to understand, like, all right, you're fasting, just break it, it's not a big issue. But a Muslim will be more aware of the sensitivities and the seriousness of fasting. If they say to you that, look, if you take your medication, then within 2-3 days you'll feel better. But if you don't take your medication, not only will it prolong, it's just going to continue getting worse, then you're allowed to break your fast. It's a judgment call, honestly. It's not something you can give a blanket ruling on. It's between you and your doctor to see how severe it is. Yeah.
I have a question about medication. So you said medication does break your fast.
Yeah.
Now what if, and this applies to a lot of allergies, but what if you have a consistent medication you have to take every day, maybe at a certain time?
Like a good example is like an asthma pump or something. Okay, that's actually very tricky. I'll get back to that. Let's not use that as an example. I'll get to that in a bit. Yeah, asthma pumps are very tricky, and I'll get to that. But let's say there's certain medications you have to take twice a day at a very particular time, and it's like a prolonged illness that you have. Are you allowed to take that medication or not? Now, that's a highly disputed issue because some scholars say technically you're breaking your fast, so you're not allowed to fast. And it's perfectly fine. You're not held accountable in the Sharia. You just don't have to fast in the month of Ramadan because of your medication. Other scholars, they say that, just take your medication and fast, and, in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything is fine. I personally, when I go take this view, I suggest to people, look, try your best to take the medication outside of the time, And if you have to take it within the time, it's fine, you don't have to fast. That's a medical excuse and you don't have to fast at that time. But I can understand if some people are like, listen, I don't want to miss out on the experience of Ramadan just because I have to take this medication. And some scholars do allow it. If you go with that opinion, طيب, there's nothing really seriously wrong about that.
Sorry, could you clarify again what exactly is fasting? Because I feel like these nuances kind of confuse me a little bit.
Yeah.
It's supposed to prevent nourishment and enjoyment. Some of these things, like some of the medications, don't really fit in either category.
So in the definition we covered, he said three things. He said two things: nourishment and treatment. Because treatment is part of it as well. So if the purpose, so it's either inedible, or it's nourishment, or it's medication. All of these things are considered consumption. So it will fall under either of these categories. It's either inedible, it gives no nourishment, or it gives no medical benefit, or it gives medical benefit, or it only gives nourishment.
But what about like the spiritual aspect?
Yeah.
Some of these things sound like, if it makes it hard for you to focus, because a lot of the aspect of fasting is also focusing, and a lot of it is like reading Quran and worship, active worship. So
Sure.
what exactly, how do you weigh that when you're taking something, for example, for medication, it's not exactly for pleasure, you're
Yeah.
taking it for nourishment, but it helps you focus more on fasting.
Sure.
But at the same time, you're,
So there are two things to, yeah, that's a very good question. There are two things to bear in mind. One is, remember, this is a very legal text, and the focus is more on the legal side of things than the spiritual side of things. That's a separate, somewhat of a separate conversation. The second thing is, when we want to figure out what breaks the fast, we're going to have to set a particular bar, because eating definitely breaks your fast. Like a whole meal will break your fast. Not eating doesn't break your fast. What is the limitation for that? So scholars have sat down and they thought, okay, like you very well pointed out, what is the definition of fasting? So they said, you're either looking at this from the spiritual angle or you're looking at this from the legal angle. Since this is a book of fiqh, we have to look at it from the legal angle. And from a legal perspective, by all outward means, is the action that this person doing fitting the definition of someone breaking the fast legally? And what does that mean? If it is edible or inedible, if it is nourishment or it is treatment, it breaks your fast. Does it have implications on your spiritual angle or not? That's where the disagreement lies. So when a person needs to take medical treatment, for instance, for a very severe migraine that they get all day, and for their their entire lives, they have to take this medication, are they allowed to take the medication or not? Understandably, scholars are going to take two approaches to this. Those who lean more towards the spiritual side and those who lean more towards the legal side. People who lean towards the more legal side, what will they say? They will say, look, the action that you are doing is undermining the legal definition of fasting, therefore you cannot fast. But don't worry about it. You're not held accountable. You're not sinful. Continue enjoying for Ramadan. But I, as a legal-minded scholar, in my right mind, cannot say what you're doing is fine, even though the spirit of the law should allow it, because I'm restricted to what the law is giving me. More spiritual or, more macro understanding type of scholars will be like, listen, you're too stuck in your bubble over here. Let's look at the higher objectives of fasting and rethink what is a breaking of fast. Taking medication, as you pointed out, doesn't really fit the definition of what the Prophet ﷺ is saying. It's referring to nourishment and enjoyment. And like you said, it's going to affect the spiritual aspect of it. Therefore, they'll say, asthma pump, continuous medication that is necessary does not fit the definition. Do you understand? So you're onto something and it's right. It all just depends on what you're more comfortable with. And people have different temperaments and personalities. Like, as much as my heart goes more towards the spiritual side of it, on a personal level, my mind works more legally. So I sympathize more with the legal side of it. And I know many people who just can't wrap their heads around this very technical legalese of like, it doesn't matter if I'm taking an asthma pump. The purpose for me is to fast. And many scholars go with that and they side on that side. Does that help clarify it? Okay. Yeah.
Not to continue on this tangent, but for example, my father
Yeah.
had a stroke,
Yeah.
and he has to take about 18 pills a day
Subhanallah.
And he has specific times set by his doctor
Yeah.
that he has to do it, right? So it's like 6 a.m., 12 p.m., 6 p.m., 9 p.m.
Yeah.
It falls during the time of
Yeah.
fast. Of course, he has to consult his doctor to ask if I can fast. The doctor did say no, but he still basically like pushed around his medication and kind of fit it to where he takes it prior to starting the fast.
Yeah.
And then, like, after breaking the fast. The issue falls now, he could have another stroke by doing this because his doctor said do not do it.
Yeah.
But he's been doing it for 3 years, only in Ramadan. How would you kind of go?
So in this situation, I would personally tell him, you don't have to fast. Take your medication. You don't have to put this, you have to understand, even those people who are legal-minded, it's not like they're inhumane. It's not like they're like, okay, since you can't take the medication, just live without your medication and go meet Allah early. They're not going to say something like that. They're not that cruel. They're not that spineless. They're going to say, you don't have to fast. Who's telling you to fast? Then the argument comes, no, I want to get the spiritual benefits of fasting. But listen, your situation is different. Allah has forgiven you. Allah has overlooked you. Don't put difficulty on yourself that you don't have to. That's that side of things. Yes, sister.
I had a question. If you have to take medication during the day, is there like, should you keep the water to a minimum?
If the
Sometimes they recommend you drink a full glass of water after your medication.
I'm assuming scholars who say that you're allowed to take medications, I'm not entirely sure what the recommendation is. But when somebody comes to me and they say, listen, I need to take medication, I would say, listen, that's going to break your fast. So drink as much as water as you want because now you're excused from fasting due to your sickness. There's no sin. There's nothing wrong with it. You know, it's perfectly fine.
And what about like if you're getting like any kind of like infusion treatments, like an IV, like hydration,
Sure.
or like a medication?
Sure. So we're going to cover that later on. It depends on where the hydration's coming through. If it's like on the hand or somewhere, there's nothing wrong with that. You see, again, sorry, to come back to your question, I'm sorry, sister, what's your name? Sorry? Sarah. Basically, this is an interesting question based on what you asked. Like, what happens if I get IV treatment and I'm getting nourishment from that? Does that break my fast or not? Legal-minded scholars will say, since it's not coming through the mouth or those other areas, even though you're getting nourishment, it does not meet the definition of breaking your fast, so you're perfectly fine. But then that's where the more spirit of the law scholars would say, but wait a second, you're undermining the entire purpose. If all day I'm just getting IV drips, I'm not getting the spiritual. They'll say, listen, your fast is breaking. So a lot of this just depends on where you lean in terms of your perspective and methodology. Yes?
So for somebody who has to take a medication and we're taking the approach that it does break their fast during Ramadan, and they have to take it at like specific times of the day, would they have to go back and like somehow make up that fast?
If they took it when they feel better, they have to make up that fast. But if it's a constant medication that they're taking every single day, then we'll talk about it later, you give fidya. You just pay a certain amount, you feed some poor people because you're unable to fast. Well, not per year, per that month that you were unable. You don't have to pay for the entire year. You have to pay for that month that you were unable to fast. Yeah. Inshallah, we'll take one more question and then carry on.
Okay, so let's say I'm really sick and if I don't, it gets worse if I keep fasting. But I want to fast because I think it's very valuable to fast in Ramadan. Do I have a responsibility upon my body where I'm like deteriorating my health to fast? Like which one?
Oh, no, definitely, you break your fast. If you're feeling sick, it's better to protect your body than this assumption of, oh, I'm doing something good, but it's very detrimental to your body. There's a difference between discomfort and detriment. If me not taking my medication is resulting in me slowly withering away, then no, I should be breaking my fast and taking my medication. But if it's a question of discomfort, then no, I should continue fasting. That's the whole purpose of fast. There's some sacrifice.
So if I like technically do something that withers my health away, is that technically cut off? Like
Yeah, you should, like if it's serious, like for instance, if I'm avoiding medication that could result in literally my death, I have to be very, very mindful of that. All right, Did we finish the page? Oh, we didn't finish the page. We're not even done with the first paragraph. Okay, second paragraph. We're still on page what? 7, 8? What are we? 6. God bless. All right. وَإِنْ كَانَ مُسَافِرًا لَا يَسْتَضِرُّ بِالصَّوْمِ فَصَوْمُهُ أَفْضَلُ وَإِنْ أَفْطَرَ وَقَضَى جَازَ. The next one is the person who's a traveler. If the person is traveling and it's not inconvenient, like remember, traveling on camelback in the scorching, sweltering heat of the Hijaz is very different than flying first class on, I don't know, Etihad Airways, right? Very, very different. So if you're comfortable, it's ideal that you fast. If there's nothing wrong with it, it's ideal that you fast. But yeah, if you're flying Spirit Airways and things are very different, and you're going to have to hold on to the rails the entire time, you have to pay for water, and it's very difficult. Or they put you with the luggage downstairs somewhere. Listen, I've flown Spirit many times, all right, so it's fine. So there's a difference between if there's difficulty or not. If there is difficulty, then don't fast. If there's no difficulty, it's actually better for you to fast. That's all he's saying over here. Just so we can get through this quickly, the next one is like, what happens if you pass away while you're sick or you're traveling? Because remember, when you're sick or you're traveling, when you're not traveling anymore or you get better, you have to make up those fasts. And if you can't make up those fasts, you have to pay for the days that you did not fast. So obviously, if a person passes away in a state of fasting or in a state of illness, that particular fast, you do not have to give qada for it. Because the fast, so to give you an example, I'm fasting today, I'm feeling very sick, I break my fast. And then I pass away because of that illness, my family doesn't have to pay for that one day that I didn't fast because I passed away, I couldn't complete that fast. There's nothing wrong with that, all right? That's just the basic ruling that he's mentioning. But if I'm sick and I don't fast for 4 or 5 days, or I'm traveling and I don't fast for 4 or 5 days, and then I get better, after Ramadan, I should make up those days that I did not fast. Okay? I should make up the days that I did not fast. 7.
This page is a duplicate of
Yes.
8.
8. All right. Alhamdulillah. A new page, yeah, but not a new section. Because we're still talking about travel and sickness. You want to do one more page and then we'll stop? One more page, inshallah. All right, the next section is, yes?
Sorry, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I have a question. So it's like a little bit, it kind of made me think of this, not exactly, but if someone, let's say, works in, I remember an example of someone I know who worked in like really hot conditions, like their job, it was like super hot, like excruciatingly hot, where they needed to drink.
Like you're selling shawarmas for something. You're in front of you're in front of that thing all day. Yeah.
But they were like work. Obviously, that's how they provided for their family.
Yeah.
They needed to work, and that was their job. But their job, like, if they didn't break their fast, like I don't know.
Like it's so intense that they will collapse.
Something like
Yeah,
that,
if it's really intense so that person would have to start, if they have no other source of sustenance and it's difficult for them to earn and they go for that job, they have to start every day fasting, but at some point if they break their fast, and they'll just make it up later on.
Okay. So that, and then let's say that they work that job for the entire year. So they would
Well, they have weekends when they're not.
That's
True. Yeah, they have the weekends or they have summer or they should get some vacation, right? All right. Traveling and sickness, right? So carrying on with this section, I'll just read through it so that everybody we can get done a bit quickly. All right. Once I miss a few days of Ramadan and I don't fast, I have to make it up outside of Ramadan. Now, when I make it up outside of Ramadan, how should I do it? Because remember, another reason why people don't fast is because if our mothers and sisters are on their period, they're not going to be fasting those days, right? So then, during that time, if they're not fasting, how do they make up that fast, right? So you can either do them consecutively or you do them separately. Both are fine. So let's say I missed 5 days of fasting. when I miss 5 days of fasting, after Ramadan, I can either fast 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 consecutively, or I can do 1 on this day, 1 on the next day. That's perfectly fine. So he says over here, the makeup of Ramadan fasting may be separated or successive. However, if one delays the makeup of previous Ramadan till the next Ramadan enters, he should fast the current Ramadan and make up the previous one after it without any financial consequences. Basically, if 2019 of Ramadan, I miss 5 days of fasting, like I said, this is very difficult for the sisters in the sense that if for whatever reason I'm unable to fast, at the time of the month I can't fast like 7, 8 days, and the whole year I was unable to fast, then the next month comes, is there a penalty for me because I didn't do it in the year? There's nothing wrong. I just wait for Ramadan to finish. After Ramadan, whatever days I have from that month and this month, I add them up together and I just make up the fast.
Is that with a good excuse, or is that like...
Well, like I said, if for someone who's on their menses, for instance, they don't have to fast. They can't fast. So whether it's a legitimate excuse or not, they're not meant to be fasting. So those days they make up. If this is talking about somebody who just broke their fast.
No, I mean, let's say, you know, gay period, you have to make them up in the next 11 months.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of just...
Yeah, whatever, because the person was, it doesn't matter. There's no penalty, no matter how the person does it. Yeah. Okay, then he says, what about somebody who's expecting, somebody who's pregnant, or somebody who's sick? If so when somebody is expecting, and the medical advice is, listen, don't even think about it, it's not a good idea to fast, that's perfectly fine. They just have to do qada when they're able to fast. They just have to do qada. There's no fidya, there's no amount that you have to pay for that. Yes?
So in terms of either like nursing or being pregnant, they don't need to fast during that time period, but they do need to make
Up the fast.
afterwards?
Yeah.
Oh.
Now, that's the thing, right? Some scholars, they say because the amount is so long, it could be an entire month, you can give the fidya instead. That's like an opinion attributed to like Ishaq ibn Rahawayh and these other early scholars. But if we're going with what the Hanafi school says, they said, and if I'm not mistaken, the other schools as well, they would have to make up that entire month outside of Ramadan.
And so because it goes pregnancy and then typically nursing for 2 years or more, depending on circumstance,
Yeah.
there could be multiple years
Yeah.
where they have not been able to do Ramadan.
Yeah.
They're required to do every year.
According to this opinion, yes.
Okay.
The other opinion is you just give fidya for each day of fasting instead. Now it's very interesting because the way he's phrasing this is like, don't worry, you don't have to give fidya, you can do qada. So from their perspective, the financial responsibility is bigger than just having to fast it. Where things kind of changed, where nowadays it's much easier to just feed and pay the expiation than having to fast. That could be something to look into. And I know certain contemporary scholars go with that minority opinion because of how difficult it is for mothers and sisters who gave birth or they're nursing. And I can see that. But like I said, usually in situations like this, I always just say, listen, ask that scholar because I know that's the opinion that he gives. I myself it's hard for me to go with it.
I'm sorry, I know we're taking a bit of time.
Listen, it's not me. You're just starving the rest of the group. So if you put it that way, I think I'll stop asking.
Do you know if there's a difference of opinion on that as well? Because I've heard that if you're pregnant,
That you don't even give fidya as well, right?
that you don't give fidya and you don't need to make it up.
That opinion, I don't know where people are getting it from. I've heard it. I've heard a particular sheikh, very famous on social media, say it once, and I don't know. I'm not that. Like that second opinion where you're at least giving fidya, I'm comfortable with that. But the idea that there's nothing responsible, that seems a bit hard to justify. There may be an opinion they're holding on to, but I would have to look into it. Yeah.
What if you neglected some fasts like over the years and you don't know how many?
You just guesstimate. You do your best to say like, all right, you know what? I think it's 7 or 8 or 15 or 20.
Like over 10 years?
10 years, then you just do ghalib al-dhann. You sit down and you calculate, it's like 100 fasts, and then you do it. Right? You do your best, yeah. Okay, the next one is, everybody wants to be a sheikh, but this is the sheikh you don't want to be. He's called a sheikh al-fani. Sheikh al-fani is the sheikh in the linguistic sense, an old man who's on the final moments of his life. Fani means he's about to pass away, but they call him sheikh fani, sheikh in the linguistic sense of he's old. Fani means he's about to pass away. So if the person is a Sheikh Fani and he can't fast, obviously if he's a Sheikh Fani, he's in the final moments of his life, very elderly person, he's about to pass away, he obviously can't do Qada either. Like if he can't fast in Ramadan, he can't do Qada either. So from the get-go, he just has to give fidyah. This happens a lot for our grandparents. They're very ill, they can't fast. So they shouldn't even try fasting. And they can't wait to get better per se because they're old. You know, for them, just from the beginning, for the whole month of Ramadan, calculate each fast. And for each day's fast, you have to feed one poor person, a day of food. So now, what does that amount to? 2 meals per day to a poor person. So hypothetically, if I send the money overseas, it costs $2 for one meal, right? $2 for one meal. 2 meals is going to cost me $4. I multiply that by the number of days he was. Yeah.
Can you pay this for your parents?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, anybody can pay for it. Yeah, you do the calculations. Okay, let's say it's $4. And it's 29 days or 30 days, you do the multiply it, and you can send it before, you can send it after, and that settles it.
So is it the food of the person living here, or?
It can be anywhere. Ideally, it's the value, if you're giving money only. You know, some people just want to give money and call it a day. It's based on the value here. But if you're feeding somebody actually, then you can feed them anywhere. Do you understand the difference? Because I can either give the money equivalent, or I can feed somebody. If I'm giving the money equivalent, then I look at the value here. But if I'm physically feeding somebody, wherever I give the money is fine. One last question before we try to finish this off. Yes? Oh, same question? All right. And the next one is, وَمَنْ مَاتَ وَعَلَيْهِ قَضَاءُ رَمَضَانِ. Whoever dies while the qada of Ramadan fast still remains upon him and he had put that in his will, his wali, executor, should feed on his behalf one poor person for each day of fasting, a half sa' of wheat or a half sa' of dates or barley. No, 1 sa' of barley. Okay, let me just explain this. Don't worry about what's mentioned over here. If a person was traveling and they were unable to fast, and because they were unable to fast, they have, let's say, 10 days of fast that they need to make up, and then they pass away. And in their will, they write that I was unable, most likely unable to fast these 10 days, please pay from my inheritance. They will do that, but how much will they pay? As I mentioned, you have to feed a person nisf sa'. Now, you have to feed a person a particular measurement. The word sa' is a cup of measurement that they use for grains and rice. That cup, just to make it simple, assume it's the size of a big mug. If you are giving something like wheat, which is high quality, you have to give half of that mug. If you're giving something lower quality, like barley, you have to give the full mug. Do you understand? It's a volume of measure. So, in my will, I will write that for every day that I did not fast, you have to feed one person. And then I, as the wali, I, as the heir of that individual, the person who's responsible for discharging his estate, will say, okay, X amount of money is going to go because he passed away without finishing his make-up fasts. If he does not write it in his will, I do not have to take it out. It's nice that I do it, obviously, but you're not forced to do it. Do you guys understand that? Yes?
The people that you feed, do they have to all be Muslim?
That's not necessary. If it's not sadaqatul, you see, that's the tricky thing. Like, you just have to give it to the poor. Zakat has to be given to the Muslims. Sadaqatul fitr and normal sadaqah does not necessarily have to be given to Muslims. Okay, the last line, as I just mentioned over here, whoever dies while qada of Ramadan fast still remains upon him, and he had put that in his will. The key words are he put it in his will, because if he does not put it in his will, it's not necessary for that person's family to take out that money. And how much will you give? You have to feed a poor person 1 sa' or half a sa', depending on the amount. So to make it simple, nowadays, half a mug of wheat amounts to about $6. You know what you give for sadaqatul fitr? They say give $10. I don't mean to, you should still give $10, that's great. But honestly, that's a bit of an overestimation. The way you figure out the precise amount is actually like $6 or $7. If you go to your local Kroger's or wherever they sell wheat and you measure it, many places where they do it, it amounts to about $5 to $6. They just say $10 because it's more convenient. How is somebody going to take out change in the middle of it? Dropping just $10 is more convenient, and it's a way of giving more charity. So now, when you're counting fidya, that small amount can add up. So if I just say $10 and it's, let's say, 100 fasts, it may add up. But if I look at the more precise number, which is, let's say $6, and it's 100 fasts, it's $600 I pay either in advance or whatnot, and I deal with the fast that I was unable to make up. Let's carry on, inshallah. We're on the scenarios of qada. As we mentioned, you have qada and kaffarah. We spoke about the practically only scenario of kaffarah. Then there are multiple scenarios of qada. We understand it in principle, but let's go through some of the specifics. Inshallah, we can change the reader to someone on this side. Any volunteers who's had a good hefty lunch and is willing to read? Ready? So scenarios of qada. In which scenarios do I simply make up the fast even though I don't have kaffarah? All right, bismillah.
Whoever begins a voluntary fast and then breaks it needs to make it up.
Okay, so the first thing is, outside of Ramadan, you have voluntary fasts. So what do I do about the voluntary fast? If I, in any way, shape, or form, break that fast, deliberate, intentional, forgetfulness is not a problem, but accidental or intentionally I break my fast, I simply have to do qada of it. The reason I think this is important to note is because some other schools of law state, like the Shafi'i scholars, they would say, if it's a nafil fast, you don't have to make it up. If you started it and at any point you feel like I don't want to continue on with it, that's perfectly fine. You do not need to complete it. But the thing is, even though they say that, they would encourage you to make it up later. It's just that the Hanafis are more emphatic about it and they say it's best to make it up. Do you understand that? So if you started a fast, try to finish it. If you, for whatever reason, break it, then complete it at a later point. Carry on.
When a minor hit puberty or someone becomes a Muslim in Ramadan, they abstain from fast breakers the rest of that day. They fast after that and do not need to make up any previous days.
So here's an interesting question. If a person does not need to fast, it should have been made clear at this point, but minors do not need to fast. A person who does not reach the age of maturity, puberty, does not need to fast. What happens, number one. Number two, if a person is not a Muslim, they obviously don't need to fast. What should these people do if A, they reach maturity in the middle of the day when they're meant to fast, or B, they accept Islam in the middle of the day? Do they technically have to make up that day's fast? As you can tell, this is a very, it's a tangent. It's really hypothetical scenario. But the idea is, if in the middle of the day somebody reaches maturity, or if somebody accepts Islam, they are not obligated to even fast the remainder of the day, so they don't have to make up that day's fast. Is that clear? Carry on.
Whoever falls unconscious during Ramadan does not need to make up that day, but should make up additional unconscious days after, as applicable.
Okay, this is an interesting case. If a person falls unconscious while they're fasting, their fast breaks. You're out of a state of consciousness, your fast will break. Now, do I need to make up that day's fast? That day where I fell unconscious, I lost my senses completely. That fast breaks, but I don't have to make up that specific day. But for whatever reason, let's say I fall into a coma, or I'm very sick, for the next 10 days I'm unconscious, then the remainder of the days I have to make up later on. Just that specific day where I fell unconscious for that middle of the day, I don't have to make that up. But all the other days, once I regain consciousness, I would have to make up those days. Okay? Carry on.
if someone declared insane regains sanity in some part of Ramadan, he would have to make up the missed days of that Ramadan and fast the remaining days.
Okay, so unconsciousness assumes that the person is not responsive, completely not responsive. The second category has to do with mental health, sanity. What happens when someone loses their sanity in the sense that there's some really severe mental health issues. This is a category that's very hard to really describe, and this is where the mental health experts get into the picture in terms of what is meant by the loss of sanity. Because sometimes a person can have a low form of mental health issues and other people have a more major form. Like for instance, sometimes a person has a very severe anxiety or what do you call that breakdown? Is it called? Like a mental breakdown. Is that considered becoming what they call majnoon, somebody who loses their sanity? And not necessarily. The idea is they lose sanity to the point that it's really affecting their fast and they don't have control over themselves. Now, that's something I don't want to get into the specifics of because it's not my area of expertise. That's more a medical expert, a psychologist who will say to you that, okay, this degree of a mental health issue deems the person incapable of continuing their fast. In theory, though, a person can continue fast if they have minor forms of mental disturbance or major forms, in which case they do not have to fast. Is that clear? Like their fast will not count, it will break. All right? But this person who does lose sanity, unlike the person who falls unconscious, has to make up that day's fast. That's a small difference. There's reasoning behind it, but again, due to the shortage of time, we won't get too much into it. Okay, next category.
If a woman's cycle begins, she needs to break the fast of that day and make it up in purity.
Yeah, so if a female, her period begins while she's already fasting, then that day's fast is broken and she will make up that day's fast later on. A few things here. Number one, in the case of other people who break their fast, they, for whatever reason, if they broke their fast, let's say it's a medical reason, or they reached maturity, they're not meant to be fasting. All of these people, they should at least not pretend to fast, but not eat in front of people so that they cause inconvenience. The exception to this is someone who reaches their period while they're fasting. If they're fasting and they reach their period, their fast breaks, they're allowed to eat openly. They can eat perfectly normal. There's no restrictions over there. Yeah, I mean, it may be a bit inconsiderate if your kids are watching and they're all like starving over there, but there's nothing wrong from the Sharia perspective if you decide not to. If you decide to eat openly, that's the slight difference between the two. Is that clear? Any questions about this particular category? Yes. Just the female whose fast breaks because of her period and she's not fasting, she can openly eat, she can eat perfectly fine, there's nothing. But anybody else, so for instance, the only reason I broke my fast was because I had a severe migraine and the doctor said to take the medication. I took the medication, now my headache is gone, but that doesn't mean I need to go to like McDonald's and get like a huge meal or something. I can still fast to not make anyone else feel uncomfortable. It would apply for the entire time. Is that clear? Any other questions on this category? Yes.
Just, one thing in terms of being like categorizing it. When you say it needs to be made up, does that mean it's like hard to make it up?
Yeah, it's wajib. Wajib. Yeah. Qada of the thing about qada of the fast is it's like practically fard, if you want to put it. Yeah, it's practically fard. All right. Next category.
When a traveler becomes resident or menstrual cycle ends during some part of the day, they should abstain from fast breakers the rest of that day.
Yeah, this is so now, as I mentioned to you, this idea. So there's a difference. All right. First of all, let's talk about the traveler. The person's been traveling for 10 days. He didn't fast all of these days, and he returns in the middle of a day of Ramadan. Let's say his flight arrives at I don't know, let's say 2 p.m. The rest of the day, everybody else is fasting. Even though he didn't fast that day because he's in the middle of his travel, he should at least avoid eating food in front of everybody else or in general. If he happens to eat, his fast doesn't break. This is more to not make anyone else feel uncomfortable. The second person is, we spoke about somebody who's on their period, they're allowed to eat openly, and that's perfectly fine. But what happens if her cycle carries on and it ends in the middle of a day of fasting? So, if hypothetically it ends at 1 p.m., then she's not allowed to fast anymore because she was already on her period during that day, so she's not meant to fast. But unlike the one who was on her period, who was allowed to eat, she cannot eat anymore. Because the reason why she's not fasting is not because of the menses of the period, it's because most of the day has gone and she's unable to fast. Now, when I say most of the day, even if part of the day passes while she is in a state of hayd, as they call it, period, she's not supposed to fast the remainder of the day, but she should do imsak. She should, at least in front of everybody, avoid eating. Do you see that subtle difference between the two? The reasoning is kind of, yes?
So what's the reasoning for her to just eat openly during that time? Is it to show people or?
Yeah, like no, not to show people. It's just because it's for a more extended time right now. So if there's going to be a lot of difficulty for her for like 7-8 days to have to hide and do it. But that last day, it's only going to be that day, and then the next day she can fast normally. So she shouldn't continue doing that. Yes.
So it's possible to like, if it's just a matter of time and you don't realize that you got it till afterwards, is that?
Well, the thing is, that's just a lot of like estimation when a person sits down and thinks like, okay, when did it start? If my estimation is it started after Maghrib, then the fast counts. If it started before Maghrib based on my best judgment, that's not something that you need to sit down and really think hard about it. Just do whatever your best judgment is and go with that. All right. Carrying on. Okay, for the rest of the day. Is that clear? All right. Page 8? 9? All right, 9. Okay, the next one is Qada and al-Fitr. Qada again is another example of Qada. This is an interesting and very relevant example. So here's the scenario. When does fasting begin? Right at the point of Fajr. That's when fasting begins. When does fasting end? At the point of sunset. During this time, I'm not allowed to eat, drink, or be intimate. So, what happens on both ends if somebody mistakes the time? So, let's say Fajr time comes in at 3:30. From my perspective, for some reason, it's 4 o'clock and I still think that Fajr time has not come in and I'm still eating. And then later on I find out, I'm like, wait, I just made a mistake right now. I miscalculated. That person's fast does not count because technically they were eating during a time that they were meant to be fasting. And they intentionally ate. Do you understand that? There's a difference between forgetfully eating and intentionally eating or accidentally eating. If that person completely forgets that there's something called fasting and they're eating, he's forgiven. This person is accidentally eating because he thought that the time of fasting hasn't set in yet. So they have to still make up that day's fast. Just calculate a bit.
If you're like 2 minutes off and you broke your fast early, that day did not count.
So here's the thing again. It goes back to what I mentioned earlier on. Spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. Scholars who are much more letter of the law, they'll tell you even if it's like 1 minute after that, you've broken your fast. But I know a number of scholars who say that as long as you've done your best judgment, it's not like 3 hours into it, it's just like a few minutes, you're good. But again, I'm siding more with the letter of the law because that's why I gave that caveat in the beginning of the class that over here we're just explaining what the letter of the law is so we understand what we have to do. Then if you want to go with a more flexible opinion, that's perfectly fine. Right, 8 questions. All right, let's start from the right side, yeah.
Okay, this is like a little bit specific, but let's say that you are
Yeah.
and you hear the adhan.
Yeah.
Can you swallow that bite?
If you're going with the letter of the law, you're not supposed to be swallowing that food. But some people, like I said, go a bit more easy and they're like, okay, just finish it off. Even if there's a few bites left, they say finish it off. I'm personally not comfortable with that. Whenever I speak to people, I try to give them the most difficult opinion so that then they can ease off according to their circumstance. So like, I would tell you right now, don't finish that morsel. But if you finish that morsel and you came to me like, hey, what happened to my fast? I'm like, don't worry about it, it's fine. Like, I want you to conceptually think about a baseline and then figure out on a day-to-day what's the best way to go about it. Yes?
So according to the letter of the law, when Maghrib starts, are you supposed to eat when you hear the adhan, or do you have to wait till the sun's completely gone and it's pitch?
So if it depends. If the adhan was called too early, it's not about whether, let's say, 8:30 p.m. is when Maghrib time sets in. The person calls the adhan accidentally at 8:15. I can't break my fast.
Sometimes even Maghrib will kind of start, but outside they're still there.
If the time of Maghrib has set in, whether adhan is called or not, I'm allowed to break my fast. So it's about the timing, not the adhan. There's another thing that's important, and again, since we are getting to a lot of specifics over here, let's just talk about it right now. And if you don't know this, Alhamdulillah, if you now know this, astaghfirullah, but anyway, there's a difference of opinion when it comes down to calculating the timings. There's like an 18 degrees and a 15 degrees, and you have to understand, okay, I'm going to take a step back and explain something. The reason why we have so many differences in the modern day compared to the past has a lot to do with the drastic changes that we're experiencing post-modernity. For instance, in the past, it was purely based on observation. I need to fast, I just look out the window and I'm like, all right, tayyib, it looks like it's Fajr time, I'm gonna stop eating. I look outside, oh, it's sunset, khalas, we're done. But now in the modern day, when we have technology to make everything so specific, it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in the sense that it's convenient, but it's a curse in the sense that once you get so specific, you're going to have a difference of opinion. Like, what specific time is it? Does the sun set exactly at Maghrib? Oh, when I go on Google, it's saying this time, but my app is saying that time, and I hear the adhan at that time. That's the problem of when you're trying to make everything fit into this very tight framework. It's convenient, but then you'll have different opinions, and it will be very confusing. So when we talk about the starting period of fasting, you'll see some masajid, some apps, some calendars, they will start in what they call an 18 degrees of depression. An 18 degrees of depression is where the sun is located. Some will say 18 degrees, some will say 15 degrees. What is 15 degrees? 15 degrees is a bit later. So if 18 degrees depression, if you're talking about where the sun is situated, that would mean hypothetically you have to stop eating at, let's say, 5 o'clock. That's where it's positioned. Others will say, no, we need a 15 degrees of depression, which is a bit later, which is, let's say, 5:30. There's already a disagreement over there. And even others will come to a difference. Now you'll see the reason all of this is happening is when we're taking pre-modern ways of determining time, which was meant to be very intuitive and natural, and we're kind of making it convenient, it's going to lend itself to so many differences of opinions. Does that make sense? Just bear that in mind. It's not that the deen is meant to be complicated with so many differences. It's that if you want that convenience, your definition of convenience is going to be very different than someone else's definition. This is just a natural outcome of how humans function. Yes?
So now my question was, now that we have a clock
Yeah.
and a second clock,
Yeah.
we know the exact precise second. Would it be bad for us to look outside now, or would we have to go with now the postmodernism clock?
I wouldn't call that a postmodernism clock. Postmodernism has a very negative connotation to it, but like a modern clock. Or we can just call it a clock. Yeah. Postmodernism has a very, very interesting political and moral connotation to it. Yeah. But so do you go with the clock or do you go with observation? Honestly speaking, both are perfectly fine. But the thing is, it comes back to that same caveat I gave to you in the beginning. Are we looking for precision over here? Are we looking for legal exactness? If that is the case, then it's the clock. If it's more your intuitive observation, then go outside, and if your hunch is that it looks like it's time to break your fast, you go with that.
Because the only reason I'm asking is my parents, when I was younger, I
Yeah.
and the adhan would start, and they told me to finish it, don't let it go to waste.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, so like I said, I personally would say don't drink that. Put it in the fridge and finish later. If you're saying like, just finish your last morsel, I'm telling you here what's the more specific. Yeah.
Yeah, like, would it be wasting if we, let's say we followed your way?
Yeah.
Would it?
You're making it seem like I'm like this minority dude holding around. Minority opinion. The madhab of this person.
Would we get bad deeds for like?
No. Because the thing is, the reason you're doing that is more to fulfill something better. It's like maintaining what the Islamic guidance is. So throwing out that morsel is not a problem.
I wanted to know, where did they get the exactness from? So in the Quran you have it, فَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ ثُمَّ
Yeah.
أَتِمُّوا الصِّيَامَ إِلَى اللَّيْلِ.
Yeah.
It seems from the ayah that's purely observation.
Yeah.
What are the exactness?
Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says Fajr, what does Fajr mean? Fajr means the beginning of the day. Now, when you go ask astronomers or like people who are, they call munajjimun, their job is to determine timing. They disagree on when does it actually begin. That's why, is it 15 minutes of depression? Is it 18% or 18 degrees? That's where this whole disagreement comes. It's less to do with Islam and it's more to do with just the nature of the field that we're operating with, like time itself. If you want to go back to the basic observational, intuitive way, that's perfectly fine, but it's very hard to live in the modern world like that where everything is based on precise timing. Now you're going to take something that's very fluid and try to kind of like force it into a paradigm that's very specific. You're bound to have differences of opinion. Yes?
So, going back to what we discussed earlier about intentions, and you said like you can make intention as long as like the majority of the day has not passed, right?
Yeah.
Before the middle of it. But if you can make the intention before the midday time comes and like still fast, then how does that not affect opening or opening your fast a minute or two before?
There's a difference between making intention and eating. Even when you make the intention, you're not allowed to eat. Like I told Muhammad, like you can't have a nice hefty breakfast and then make intention. Your intention needs to happen on an empty stomach. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Interesting, like I said, this is like kind of the challenges you have to face. We call it an istifta, when you're in a darul ifta answering questions and a question comes. A question came when I was doing my ifta. A person asked a question. Whoever printed that Ramadan schedule made a big mistake, and every single day they were off by 2 minutes. So the entire month they broke their fast 2 minutes early. There was some typo or something happened when they were making the calendar. What do you do with all their fast? And if I were to give them that very strict answer, I would tell them, listen, everybody make up their fast again because you're supposed to. But it becomes very difficult for the vast majority of people. So the answer in that context would be, listen, in theory, if it's not too difficult, try your best to make it up. But if you can't or you only do it partially, don't worry about it. It's perfectly fine. Does that make sense? Yeah. And go hunt the guy who made that calendar. He's gonna have some.
The nice thing about the ISF calendar
Yeah.
is they usually tell you at the bottom, like with the asterisks,
Yeah.
add like 3 minutes.
Add like 3 minutes. The thing with adding the 3 minutes, what do they call it? No, one is add 3 minutes when you eat, and some people have this thing where like add 5 minutes before your fajr time so you stop eating. The problem, that's a good practice, but then people end up adding it to the time. Like a lot of calendars I've seen, what they'll tell you is, this is what you call the time of fajr, and this is what you call imsak. You'll see some calendars do that. The problem is that it becomes very confusing in that I have people coming to me all the time and saying, wait, can I eat during the imsak period? And technically you can, it's just to be safe. So you can tell people that, but what ends up happening is a lot of people, they eat during the imsak time, and they think that their fast is broken. So it's not a problem if you're adding 3 minutes, but when you're not eating, going backwards, that's when it gets tricky.
Can you go backwards though 3 minutes?
You can, whatever, but that's perfectly fine, you can. But the thing is, if you eat at the time your fast is perfectly fine. All right, let's carry on. Qada and Fitr. We did part of this already. Next is the person who sees the hilal, a Fitr, by himself. Yeah, who's reading? Somebody was reading. Yes, yeah, go ahead. If someone
spotted the crescent of Eid al-Fitr just by himself, he should not break it.
So this is interesting, right? Basically, as we mentioned, there's a whole process of testimony when a judge is going to accept the sighting of the moon and inform the rest of the community that, listen, it's time for you to fast right now. Okay? When it comes to Ramadan, if one person sees it, and this is a very interesting reason I'm about to tell you. If one person sees the beginning of Ramadan, we're going to accept his statement. But if one person sees the ending of Ramadan, we're not going to accept his statement. I'm going to repeat that again. One person comes to me, and if I'm the judge of Wisconsin, right, the Muslim Qadi of Wisconsin, right, and he comes to me and he's like, hey, listen, I just sighted the moon. Should we start the month of Ramadan? And I'll say, listen, you're one person. I'll go through the whole process, and I'll say, you know what? We're going to start our fasting. I'll announce it. Everybody starts fasting, Taraweeh, everything is fine. 30 days later, well, not 30 days, it'll have to be 29 days. 29 days later, he comes back and he's like, oh, by the way, I just saw the moon. Again, I saw it by myself and nobody else has seen it. And he's just one person. Will I accept his statement or not? And the answer is, I will not accept his statement. Why is there a difference between the beginning of Ramadan and the ending of Ramadan? Especially when it's cloudy, because when it's not cloudy, you're going to need multiple people to do it. But if it's cloudy and one person came to me to start Ramadan, that's perfectly fine. But to end Ramadan and it's a bit cloudy and one person comes to me, why will I not accept his statement? And the reason for this is generally people are trying to get done with Ramadan and they're really excited for Eid al-Fitr. So even people who have no business looking for the moon, they're going to be out there looking for the moon to expedite the process. So if nobody's there looking for it and you're the only person and everybody's eager for Eid to start, there must be something wrong with your testimony. So people are more excited to see the moon for the commencement of Ramadan than they are for the commencement of Eid al-Fitr. So it's more likely that people will go out to sight the moon for the beginning of Eid al-Fitr. Why is it that you're the only one person? For Ramadan, yeah, I guess people are a bit frightened for it to start, so you're the only person who went out, so we're going to accept your statement. But what happens if it's cloudy or not cloudy? He'll get into specifics. But that one individual who went by himself, and he was excited, he went and he saw the moon and he comes back and the judge says, sorry, I'm not going to take your statement because you're the only person. That person himself, should he fast or should he not fast? He should still fast. Even though he saw it. Technically for him, Eid began. But because he should follow the rest of the community, he should still fast on that day.
So this is contrary then to if he was the only one to see the start of Ramadan.
And it was cloudy, then everybody's going to do it. Everybody's going to do it. Okay, now, وَإِذَا كَانَ بِالسَّمَاءِ عِلَّةٌ Sorry, carry on.
If the sky is unclear for spotting the crescent of Eid al-Fitr, then the imam will only accept testimony of 2 men or 1 man and 2 women.
Okay, just a quick point I want to mention about testimony. Why is it that sometimes you'll see 2 men and 1 man and 2 women? A lot of this has to do with the way societies operated in the past, in that men tended to be outside much more than women. So that's why you would need at least 2 women. The likelihood of just 1 woman being out would be much less than 2 women. So that's kind of the rationale of 2 women, 1 man, or just 2 men. But at any rate, if there's an overcast, then, and it's Eid al-Fitr, and the same thing applies to the beginning of the month for Eid al-Adha, Dhul Hijjah. But let's say Eid al-Fitr for our context, if it's cloudy, you need at least 2 men or 1 man and 2 women. A single individual's claim will not be accepted. And if the sky is clear, you're going to need an entire group of people to testify. Okay? This whole discussion is not too relevant for us. It's just an FYI, you're aware of the process that goes behind declaring the commencement of Ramadan or Eid.
I know it's not
So interestingly, I mean, if you want to ask, and while we're at it, we might just get more into the weeds as much as we can. There's like 6 opinions, because it's all like the idea of a large group, it really depends. One scholar says 50 people. One scholar says the number of people that if they were in your masjid, there's no more space left for people to come inside. Some people, so this is purely subjective. Like, what's considered a large group, you leave it to the community, right? Once you start putting a number on it, then it's like more for the sake of a number. Because remember, what's the judge trying to figure out over here? That there's enough people that I'm confident they're not getting together making up some story, right? If there could be 10 people and they're all buddies and they're all like, I don't know, 10th graders at like Salam Academy or wherever, right? And you're like, all right, you guys are a bit too cozy and comfy with each other and you guys are like the troublemakers in class. Even though you have like 50 of you guys, I still don't trust you guys. So having a group of people may not be enough if the judge just feels there's some doubt. As opposed to 4 people who are coming together and they're respectable people, 4 or 5 people, and that's a large group because I respect them. It's more about how much confidence I get from the information that I'm being presented with. Exactly. All right. What page is this? 10? تلك عشرة كاملة. All right, mashallah. So technically we're done with the major laws of fasting. The next section is on i'tikaf, just 2 pages on i'tikaf, and then we're going to come back to some important rules regarding what breaks your fast. That next chapter is going to be very important, but as an FYI, let's just go through i'tikaf. Now, i'tikaf has different categories, like just like fasting has different categories. There are primarily, we can say, 3 types of i'tikaf. The first type is the wajib, necessary form of i'tikaf. The second is the sunnah form of i'tikaf. And the third is the recommended form of i'tikaf. Now, the necessary form goes back to a vow. If a person made a vow saying that, Ya Allah, if I pass my exam, I will do i'tikaf in the masjid for 3 days. That is the only time doing i'tikaf is mandatory. All right? It's mandatory. The other scenario is what we call the sunnah method of i'tikaf. What is the sunnah method of i'tikaf? The sunnah method of i'tikaf is specifically the last 10 days of Ramadan. In our minds, when we think of i'tikaf, we think about this. But a person can do i'tikaf in the masjid outside of Ramadan as well. They can do i'tikaf in the masjid any time of the year. That's perfectly fine. But the sunnah mu'akkada, the emphasized form of i'tikaf, refers to the last 10 days of Ramadan. All right? The last 10 days of Ramadan. This is the sunnah time, and this chapter primarily is going to be speaking about that level of i'tikaf. And this brings us to the last one, which is recommended. Recommended is any time of the year. You know what? You just want to disconnect from just your busy life and you want to spend some time, just go to the masjid if they allow you and they don't freak out a bit. You can stay there for a few days and do what you got to so you can benefit from that experience. Now, there are, like I said, like he's going to describe over here, there are different categories. There's the wajib, the sunnah, and the recommended. This category, although it starts off by saying i'tikaf is recommended, he's still talking about the sunnah category. The last 10 days of Ramadan, that's what we're speaking about over here. Is that clear? Any questions on that so far? Let me explain a term. You may have heard of this before, kifaya versus ayn. There are certain things that are mandatory for the entire community to do. So if a few people do it, they absolve the rest of the community. So an example of this is Salatul Janazah. If a person passes away, it's the responsibility of the community to attend their funeral, regardless of how busy that community is. Somebody needs to attend their funeral. If a few people attended, everybody else is absolved. But if a person passes away and no one attended their funeral, that entire locality is sinful. Likewise with i'tikaf, it's heavily emphasized, very emphasized. So if the whole community leaves out i'tikaf, once it's fine. But few years successively, if they leave it out, that entire community will be sinful for that. There has to be some people taking on that responsibility. Yeah.
What if there's only one person?
In that community?
No.
I'm like, where are they living in, like the Bermuda Triangle or somewhere?
No, that comes.
For the i'tikaf?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Even if one person does it, that's perfectly fine.
Sorry again.
Sure.
Is that for the whole 10 days, at least one person needs to make sure that's done on every day of lessons, or just
Because if a person does less than 10 days, he hasn't done the sunnah, so it has to be that. Yeah, 10 days, yeah. And by the way, you should, doing i'tikaf is, mashallah, it's a very revitalizing experience. How many people here has ever done a full 10 days of i'tikaf? Okay, clearly not many of us, all right? So I'm telling you, i'tikaf is a very transformative experience in a masjid. Consider it at some point in your life. Now, this begs the question, okay, what's the i'tikaf for the sisters versus the i'tikaf for the males? Is there a difference between the two? In theory, the i'tikaf can be, okay, according to the Hanafi school, i'tikaf for males happens in the masjid, and i'tikaf for sisters happens in the home. I'tikaf happens in the home. Like you seclude a place and you do i'tikaf over there. But if there's proper arrangements, there's like a separate area for sisters to come to the masjid and stay over there where they have their own privacy and they're separate. Some scholars have allowed that i'tikaf, saying that it's fine as long as the proper segregation, the proper privacy is all put into place. But from the Hanafi perspective, the i'tikaf for women and sisters is at home. Meaning they will do the exact same thing as everybody else, but they will stay inside of their home, and there are certain laws and rules and regulations that they will follow. Yes?
So i'tikaf is done in the masjid, as we know. Now, for example, like the masjid offers like suhoor for those that stay for i'tikaf and etc. It happens in a different room.
We're getting to that, inshallah. We're still in the introductory section. So can you eat, can you not eat, where can you go, where, all of that's going to come, inshallah. Is that clear? So at some point in your life, there's so much reward for i'tikaf. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam himself, every single year he did i'tikaf except for 1 year. And that 1 year he missed, the following year he did twice. He stayed 20 days in the masjid. So i'tikaf is a really good opportunity. Like, don't just get a bunch of friends and do i'tikaf together. That ends up becoming like a, I don't know, that just ends up becoming, what do you call it? Like a sleepover, like a party or something like that. Go somewhere where you're not with your friends, you're with a bunch of uncles that don't want to talk to you and you don't want to talk to them. Like, that's the most beneficial i'tikaf you can ever have. It's like, I can't do that because it's really difficult for me to do i'tikaf because every time I do i'tikaf, I have everybody coming around me asking questions, and I say like, I'd rather do i'tikaf in some other place. And even for the sisters, if there's arrangements in a place where you can do it in the masjid, that's a separate scenario. But let's say you do i'tikaf in home, it's a very, very beneficial experience. Growing up, I used to see my mother do it all the time. She took out 10 days and she would stay in a separate area just for herself, just to detach from all the busyness of the day, all the crazy, especially in Ramadan, having to worry about the kids and, cooking and cleaning and working and all that stuff. You don't get to enjoy Ramadan. But carving out 10 days where you don't have to deal with anybody gives you the real taste and feel for Ramadan. So consider it at some point, it will be really beneficial. Ala kulli hal, let's see, let's find another reader, inshallah. Anis? All right. We can start from i'tikaf. I'tikaf is recommended, which is defined.
I'tikaf is recommended, which is defined as staying inside the mosque with fasting and the intention of i'tikaf.
As I mentioned to y'all, mustahab are recommended in this context refers to sunnah mu'akkada. He just said recommended in a broader sense. He's talking about it being sunnah mu'akkada. And what is i'tikaf? Remember, I'tikaf has a very specific definition. You don't just go and chill in the masjid. You go to the masjid, you're fasting during the day also, and you have the intention of i'tikaf. Okay? You have the intention of i'tikaf. So you have to be fasting in order for it to be the 10 days of fasting. The 10 days of sunnah i'tikaf. All right, carry on.
Following are forbidden upon the person in i'tikaf. Sexual intercourse, fondling, or kissing are forbidden. If he ejaculates due to kissing or fondling, his i'tikaf is nullified and he would have to make it up.
Yeah, obviously a person cannot be doing these things, but if it does happen, his i'tikaf is nullified and they're going to have to do qada.
He should not leave the
By the way, when does this also become relevant? If a female is doing i'tikaf in her home, she has to observe the same rules. So she can't be intimate with her spouse during those 10 days.
He should not leave the mosque except for a necessity or for Jumu'ah.
So he should not leave the masjid unless there's a necessity. Necessity means you need to use the... Remember, the bathroom area, the eating area, all these areas aren't part of the masjid. They're outside of the masjid. To go outside, you're allowed to do that so long as it's a necessity. You're going out to eat, you're going to use the bathroom, you're going for Jumu'ah. Now, why don't you just pray Jumu'ah in your masjid? This is because back in the day, they had a jami' masjid. They had a large masjid that was meant for everybody, and the small masjids, they would not hold Jumu'ah over there. So all the different communities, they would meet up at one place and then do their Jumu'ah over there. So to go there is perfectly fine.
However, there is no problem in buying and selling during i'tikaf in the mosque as long as merchandise is not brought inside the mosque.
So you can buy and sell. I mean, this is interesting. Back in the day, that would be a bit weird. You'd have to like speak outside of the window. Like, how are you meant to buy and sell without bringing things inside? But nowadays, if you're on your phone and you're buying on something on Amazon, like you're just quickly, you need to buy, I don't know, renew the schedule of some groceries that are meant to come. You can do that. Just make sure the address you put is not the masjid. Then that's perfectly fine. That's what he means by as long as the merchandise is not brought inside the mosque, you're perfectly fine in the masjid. Yes?
Considering this to be a sunnah mu'akkada, what would be the qada for it? Like, we need to...
Like if you break it, you would have to, according to some scholars, you just have to make up one day, that day that you broke. Because, so this is saying if I'm doing 10 days of fasting, of i'tikaf, and on the third day I have, for whatever reason, can't continue on and I leave, I've broken my i'tikaf. Some would say you have to do all 10 again, but the easier opinion that many go with is just that one day you have to make up.
And in the month of Ramadan?
It doesn't have to be the month of Ramadan. You can do any time, yeah.
Going on that, does itikaf have to be only during the last 10 days, or can it be like the first 10 days?
If it's sunnah, it has to be the last 10 days.
Would it count towards the sunnah
No.
of the community if it was done outside the last time?
It will not.
Okay.
It has to be the last 10 days. Yeah.
You should only speak beneficial things, but total silence is discouraged.
Yeah, he should only speak what is beneficial. The purpose of i'tikaf is literally the refinement of the soul, detoxing, just your mind and your spirituality. If you're busy speaking to others and, they say, قِلَّةُ الْكَلَامِ قِلَّةُ الْمَنَامِ قِلَّةُ الْإِخْتِلَاطِ مَعَ الْأَنَامِ. There's like a famous, just a really quick way that they say, قِلَّةُ الطَّعَامِ. Try not overeating while you're doing i'tikaf, because mashallah, people treat the mu'takifeen like guests and hujjaj, and they're just like stuffing them with food and bringing food at night, bringing food early on, and then these guys are like smuggling like goodies, and it gets really, like the whole purpose is lost in terms of the food. Then the second is like just speaking, do your best, like just detach yourself. I'm not here to make pals or friends. I didn't like take off 10 days from work or school just so I can sit here and talk to people and waste my time. But on the other hand, he says, don't go into absolute silence. What he means by don't go into absolute silence is because in certain cultures, there's this idea that sawmul samt. Sawmul samt is, just like you fast from eating, we're going to fast from speaking. If you consider this a religious action, that's wrong. But if you just stay silent the whole time, like if you're the only one doing i'tikaf, you're not like obligated to just start talking to yourself because you're not allowed to be quiet. That's perfectly fine. It's when you do that, like you're looking in the mirror and you're like, hey, it's wajib for me to talk, so let's just, and somebody passes by, and you're like, all right, this i'tikaf is getting to this dude's head, it's too long. That person, he doesn't have to, it's fine if he's quiet the whole time, but when you don't talk as a religious practice is when it becomes an issue. Yeah.
But can Quran out loud be considered a speech?
No. He's talking about speaking with other people. Yeah. Okay, carry on.
If someone in Itikaf has sexual intercourse, whether by night or by day, forgetfully or deliberately, his Itikaf becomes null.
Yeah, obviously these are things they're not allowed to do, but it does break their Itikaf. Yes.
Yeah, good question. So, considering a lot of us have do telecommuting, like work remotely.
Yeah.
So, in the condition of Itikaf or the masjid, you're not doing any new transactions. So
Yeah.
you're like already working on a job that you're doing.
So again, if you want to, if let's say for instance my job is remote, can I work remotely from the masjid? Yes, but you're not getting the full benefit of the i'tikaf. There's two components to it, like we've realized by now. There's the legal side of it and the spiritual side of it. Did I check the box of doing i'tikaf? Yes. Am I leaving as a much better person? Perhaps, but not to the extent had I completely detached from all of these things. Yes?
In terms of the last 10 days, Itikaf, does it have to be the full 10 days or can it be part?
If it's the sunnah mu'akkada, it has to be the full 10 days. But remember, that doesn't mean it's a zero-sum game. If you go for 3 days, you will still get the reward of i'tikaf. It will just fall into the recommended category. Is that clear? All right.
If he leaves the mosque, even for a moment, without a valid excuse, his Itikaf becomes nullified. According to Abu Hanifa radiallahu anh, his 2 students said, it is not void unless it is for more than half a day.
So this is interesting, right? This is getting into the difference of opinion of, let's say I sit for i'tikaf. Now, the purpose of i'tikaf is I'm inside of the masjid and I don't leave. If I have an excuse, I can leave. But once I leave and I don't have an excuse, what's considered leaving? Like, is it the fact that I just step out? Does that break my i'tikaf? Or does it mean I'm out for a significant duration of time? So, scholars have different angles and perspectives on this. Some say the moment you step out, technically you're not in the masjid. So technically your i'tikaf is broken. That's the spirit, that's the letter of the law. The spirit of the law, the 2 students, remember I talked about Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani and Qadi Abu Yusuf, the Sahibain, the 2 companions, they went with the spirit of the law. And they said, look, even though you left the masjid, as long as you're not gone for more than half of the day, even without an excuse, you have still retained your i'tikaf because for most of the day, you were in the masjid. And this opinion actually gives people a lot of flexibility. Nowadays, when people ask about i'tikaf, I generally give them this opinion if they're working people, like working professionals. They're like, okay, I can't take off completely, but what I will do is, if you look at half of the day, what is half of the day? That's another thing, like half a day, are you talking about half of daylight? Or are you talking about half of 24 hours? But let's take half of daylight, right? So you have 12 hours, half of daylight, you're talking about, let's say like 6 hours. I can still go and work at least a few hours and then come back and continue to do my i'tikaf if you go with that. Will you reap the full rewards of i'tikaf? Absolutely not. Like, you're not gonna get the purpose of i'tikaf, but you're still doing something better than nothing. Is that clear? Well, that's an udhr, right? You're allowed to do that regardless. If there's an emergency, if I get a call that my son injured himself and I need to quickly go and rush him to the hospital, that's perfectly fine. I can do that. It's an udhr. Some would say that's not the same udhr, because udhr in the first context is more like you need to relieve yourself or go to the masjid, but it's still a necessity. This is saying, I don't know, I just need to go for a stroll in the morning. Or, you know what, my brother's having his birthday party and I just want to show up for that. All right, tayyib, go, but don't go for too long. All right, what time is it? 2:36. Okay, let's try to get this done, inshallah. Carry on.
Whoever obliges himself to do i'tikaf for a number of days, it would necessarily include the nights as well. The i'tikaf would be consecutive days even if he didn't stipulate it.
This is interesting, like if a person says, I am going to fast 3 days, right? Again, this is a very technical issue, but it's like, okay, what's the definition of a day? Is a day daylight hours, or is a day 24 hours? So you can't say, I made intention to do i'tikaf for the day, and in your mind you're thinking about sunrise to sunset. Day refers to the whole day. It's just a technical issue. Thought to end off with that. طيب, I can tell people are getting a bit tired. We have the last section. I do want everyone to be in their fullest while we do this section. We'll take a quick 3-minute break. Inshallah, 3-minute break to stretch, take a walk around, come back. Inshallah, think as though you're in Itikaf. Don't go out for too long, just come right back, and inshallah we can carry on. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidil anbiya wal mursaleen. Wa ba'd. Okay, here's the last section. It's actually, by saying it's a section may overstate how long it is. It's not that long. It's actually, for all intents and purposes, it's 1 page. The other pages, we're not even going to actually go through it because it may make things more complicated. What we want to focus on is this 1 page. And the purpose of this 1 page is providing a comprehensive definition of what it means that you have consumed something, you have ingested something, you have taken in something. Because as you can tell by the questions many of you asked, what's the difference between an IV drip versus taking Tylenol? What does it mean to eat? What does it mean to take medication? So, the following definition is very, very precise and very technical. So, if you do find the language to be legalese, again, that's by choice. It has to be like that. And what we will do is explain a few things. When we say eating or taking medication, these are very general terms. From the perspective of the Sharia, it's very specific. There are 3 things that happens when we talk about taking something in, medicine, food, or whatnot. One is what we call the entry point, and in Arabic it's called the manfadh. Manfadh, the entry point. The second is the end point, which is called the jawf. And the third is called the mode of delivery, what we call wusul. So, from the perspective of the Sharia, in defining or thinking about eating something, taking medicine, drinking, ingesting something, these are 3 things that you need to be mindful of. Number 1, we need to be mindful of the entry point. Then we have to be mindful of the end point. Then the mode of delivery. And then those are the 3 things. And then just one last added issue, and this is where a disagreement comes in, and we'll talk about that, is the nature of what you have consumed. Is it edible, inedible? Is it beneficial? I kind of pointed towards that issue earlier on. So to make it easy, just remember these 3 points. The first is the entry point, what we call the manfadh. In order for something to break your fast, it has to go through a specific entry point and reach an end point. What are the entry points and what are the end points? The entry points are mentioned over here. They are al-fam, wal-anf, wal-dubur, wal-ja'ifa, wal-thaqba, wal-udhun in kanat al-tabalatu makhrumatan. So, they are the mouth, the nose, the rectum, abdominal injury, puncture, and ear if the I think it's tympanic. If there's some medical expert here, they can correct me. Membrane is perforated. Basically, your eardrum is perforated. These are the entry points. What are these places? Number 1, the mouth. Anything that is considered eating or breaking your fast has to either come through your mouth. Number 2, the nose. It's taken in through the nasal entry. Number 3, from the rear. Some type of medication sometimes people take goes through the rear. Number 4, abdominal injury means it's directly administered into your abdomen, your stomach. This is a very rare circumstance and it's more medical than anything else, so it's not too applicable to us. That last one, the puncture or the ear, just understand this. Usually when something goes inside of the ear, it's not a problem unless your eardrum is perforated. In that case, when you put oil in there, it makes its way to the throat. Do you understand that? So this is the entry point. In order for something to break your fast, it has to come through these entry points. Otherwise, it will not break your fast. So when we talk about IV drips, it's put into your hand. If you talk about like a nicotine patch, you put it on your whatever, your forearm or your side. If you take, just think about it. If it's not coming through these entry points, it will not break your fast. Is that clear? There's other parts to it. Let's go through the whole definition and then I'll take some questions, all right? Once it goes through the entry point, that's still not enough. It then has to go to an end point that is regarded by the Sharia. What are these end points? They are halq, ma'da, and am'a. What are they? The throat, the stomach, or the intestines. The throat, the stomach, or the intestines. Once it reaches any of these entry points, from there it has to go to an end point. If it does not reach that end point, it is not regarded. So to give you an example, anybody heard of, what's that medicine? It's starts with an H. Homeopathic medicine. Anybody ever taken homeopathic medicine before? Homeopathic medicine is basically, you can call it a placebo or not. If you say it, they'll get offended, but whatever it's called, like there's a type of medication where you put it beneath the tongue and it absorbs into the cavities beneath the tongue. It doesn't go to the throat. You just put it there and it gets absorbed. So now here's the question. Did it go through an entry point, the mouth? Yes. But did it go to an end point? It did not, because it didn't go to the throat. It was absorbed into the cavities beneath the tongue. So that does not break your fast, and that's not considered eating or taking medication, because based on the technical definition provided here, it does not break your fast. What will break your fast is if I take medication like Tylenol, it enters the mouth and then it passes the throat, therefore it breaks my fast. Where it goes past the throat, that's irrelevant. But these are the two things that need to be considered. Do you guys understand? Yes?
What about the remnants of the homeopathic medicine? Like what if you swallow it?
Usually it doesn't have any taste to it. If it does have a taste, then that's a separate ruling. But if there's some small parts remaining that you swallow, then you'd have to look at the size of it. If it's very small and insignificant, not a problem. But if it's significant in size, then yeah, it could break the fast. Yes? Okay, that's fine.
So this is very technical.
Yeah, sure.
There's a concept in medicine called bioavailability, and it's basically the ability of a molecule to kind of transmit throughout your body. Some medications have very high ability to penetrate through all of your cells. So even like nicotine patches, for instance, you can put them on your shoulder, put them on your arm. They're not necessarily going through your mouth, but they're definitely getting full penetration throughout your entire body.
Yeah.
So they have effects everywhere. In terms of that then, is that also relevant? Like suppose you take something.
It is, but based on the letter of the law, no, it does not break the fast. But some people would say avoid it altogether because of it kind of undermines the spirit of the whole concept of fasting. All right, is that clear? All right. Then the next thing is what we call the mode of delivery. This is where there is some difference of opinion. You don't need to get too much into specifics, but the idea here is when you consume something, does it have to stay there? This is getting very technical, but it's like, let's say somebody takes medication and it doesn't stay there and it goes away right away. What happens? Like, I'll give you a very practical example. What happens when somebody does an endoscopy? You're doing an endoscopy, right? And you have the tube, goes through the mouth, goes past the throat. Technically it entered, it's gone past the throat. Does your fast break or not? Now, the reason why it breaks, believe it or not, has more to do with the lubricant that they put around it. You're ingesting that, so it breaks. But technically, if somehow a person was able to use it with lubricant that doesn't really go through, which is very unlikely, but hypothetically, the debate is, is that considered staying there or not staying there? That's where scholars now begin to debate more about it. Don't worry too much about the technicalities, but if it just passes there, the more straightforward understanding it is it does break your fast. Okay? And the last thing, which again, did you have a question? The last thing over here is that thing that you're swallowing, according to some scholars, they say it needs to have a meaningful kind of fast-breaking quality. Nutritional value or medicinal benefit, that's what happens. If you eat something inedible, you swallow it, according to this opinion, your fast doesn't even break. So that example we did of somebody eating iron or somebody eating a date seed, that should not break according to some scholars. All of this, as you can tell, is trying to figure out what the Sharia wants from us. And if a person says, listen, all this stuff is just too complicated, then let's go back to page 1. Not everybody's meant to be a mujtahid. Some people are just meant to be doing taqleed, and that's exactly why. We're just getting a glimpse into the mind and responsibility of a scholar sitting down over here trying to like split hairs, trying to figure out, okay, what do I do with this person? I'm going to have to figure out, what did they eat? How did it go through? How long did it stay? Is it nourishing? It is medicinal? Is it not? Which opinion is it? Which madhab is it? Doing all of that requires a lot of effort, and every time a scholar gives an answer, they go through that entire process. Now, if you want to say, listen, man, I don't know what deen you're following, this does not sound like Islam to me, Islam is meant to be very straightforward. The thing is, that simplistic approach or that simplistic comment of yours, unfortunately, does not face the reality of human existence. Human existence is complicated. These scenarios, what are you going to do? Either you're just going to say, okay, when you eat X, Y, and Z, I'll just say your fast breaks. Or I'll just say your fast doesn't break. But on what grounds? I need to give a reasoning why I'm doing that, and that's why scholars split hairs in trying to understand all of this. That's why they say what you're eating. Another debate is, what happens if it accidentally goes in your mouth versus you actually putting it yourself, right? Like, bad example, but let's say you're riding your bike and I don't know, like an insect goes in your mouth. What do you do then? You didn't choose to do that versus you actually putting in. These are many more specifics for our purposes to make this more actionable and something that we remember and we retain. Just remember this. If something enters one of the manfadh mu'tabar, the entry points, and then it passes the end point, it breaks my fast. Don't worry about all that extra stuff. Is it medicinal, not medicinal? Does it stay for some time, doesn't stay for some time? Is that clear? Do you guys understand? Yes?
So what about asthma inhalers?
Okay. Now, asthma inhalers are very interesting because I'm no expert in any of these medical fields, so I'm the last person to be talking about this, but the few doctors that I've spoken to, what they've been saying is when you inhale from an asthma pump, it depends on how you're defining the throat. Like, what is the throat? So there's the food pipe, there's where you drink, and then there's the oxygen pipe. Like, what is considered the throat? So now from the Sharia perspective, if we're talking about the food pipe and what's the other pipe, the trachea? What's the trachea? It's where it's oxygen. Oxygen, right? Is the trachea considered part of the throat or not? And although technically scholars have always said that it's part of the throat, a number of scholars are saying, what does the trachea have to do with the halaq, with the throat? So it shouldn't count. And scholars who define it like that will say there's nothing wrong with an asthma pump because when you take in the asthma pump, it basically goes into the trachea and the amount that goes through the throat is so insignificant, just normal breathing inhales more than what you get from that asthma pump. Honestly, as you guys know by now, I'm Mr. Letter of the Law. So like, you will know what answer I will give on this. But in my heart of hearts, I can see why people will be sympathetic towards this view. And I almost always tell somebody who tells me, I have to take an asthma pump and it's very difficult. I'll say, listen, there are a number of scholars who allow it. If you go with that scholar's opinion, I have no issue with it. Again, it's all about definition. It's just how law functions. I have to continuously remind this to everybody because at some point you're like scratching your head and wondering like, man, I thought this was the Fiqh of Ramadan and not like the Fiqh of complications. Like everything is just like further divided, and that's basically what a person has to do. Now, these last pages, they're not too important because they are called additional nuances and differences of opinion. Just the one point that he mentions in the ending is, remember, this whole discussion that we've had right now has more to do with our understanding of anatomy, human anatomy, than it does to do with the Sharia. When we're saying taking something through the throat, or this is considered an entry point, or this is not considered an entry point, what has medicinal benefit, what doesn't, this has less to do with the Sharia and has more to do with the experts in the field who will tell you that, listen, in our field, this is what we call the throat. In our field, this is what nourishment means. And that's why there has to be a panel of scholars as well as experts to determine the specifics of this. Yeah.
So for those who consider the windpipe not to be part of the throat, what would be their ruling about smoking then?
Well, technically, if it goes to the trachea, and that's it, and there's nothing that goes to the throat. But from what I recall, those scholars said it actually goes through the throat as well. There's a bunch of particles that go through, as opposed to the way that the asthma pump works. It's meant to go straight into the trachea. Yeah, so I'll give you guys a few examples. There's a list compiled by one scholar in the UK who goes through like a list of medical interventions, he calls them. And this is just on my laptop, but I'll just read them out and let's see how we can think about this, right? So the first situation, kind of consider this like a small exam based on what we've learned so far. Oral medication that is swallowed. If I take a Tylenol, what happens to my fast? It breaks my fast because it's an entry point and then there's an end point. Okay, the next one. They call it sublingual. Basically, it's a type of spray. Or it's homeopathic medicine. I kind of gave you guys the answer to this already, but let's say I use a spray, like, sometimes you have a specific spray that's not flavored, but you put it in your mouth, and then it dissolves inside of the mouth. Then there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't break your fast. Because why? It reaches the mouth, but doesn't go past the throat. You can argue that, doesn't it mix with your saliva? But no, this medicine specifically gets absorbed in the cavities within the mouth. Oral inhaler, like an asthma pump.
No.
Well, it depends, right? It depends on how you're defining the throat. This scholar is saying, yes, it does invalidate the fast. But then you're going to say, oh man, you heartless scholar, this person, is it his fault that he has an asthma pump or she has an asthma pump? We're actually being more convenient. We're saying you don't have to fast. Like, it's a bit easier that you're free for the whole month of Ramadan. If you choose not to eat, that's up to you, and maybe inshallah you'll be rewarded, but this is trying to make things easier for you. Okay, another one, concentrated oxygen. Some people have an oxygen mask when they go to sleep, and they intake oxygen. Will this break the fast? No, because the oxygen itself is not something that's a mufattir. It's not something that breaks your fast. All right, the next one, a nebulizer, where there's other chemicals and other ingredients inside of what you're inhaling, other forms of gas. Yes. Huh? Well, it all depends, but if we're going, again, with what's mentioned over here, it will break the fast. Next one, dental treatment without swallowing anything. Which is very difficult, but if it does happen, you just have a lot of leftovers in your mouth, and you're going to have to get rid of that. But if you don't swallow anything and they're just cleaning up your teeth, that's perfectly fine. Sorry? All right. Okay, I'm about to say a bunch of, now I know what it feels like when people hear like Islamic terms, they're complicated. I'm about to read out a bunch of complicated medical terms over here, which I don't even know what it means. I'm about to guess. Any doctors in the room? Okay. Medication via endotracheal, intubation, in pseudo? That sounds like a different language to me.
They put a tube down your mouth, past the mouth, into the trachea,
Yeah.
the esophagus.
Yeah. There you go. There you have it.
But if you're intubated, you're unconscious.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Whatever that means, does it break your fast? I guess you don't even understand the question for all that purpose. But assuming that you have something like this, he's saying over here, if you're considered the trachea not part of the halq, it does not break the fast. It's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
guess that maybe it is a good spirit versus law or a letter of the law because like there's who said you'd be unconscious.
Yeah.
So in the end, it's kind of like you're asking about something that the other part of it already means that you broke your.
Yeah, because he's kind of, yeah. So technically, if the person is, what's the word, anesthesia, when you're anesthetic, whatever, right? Are you in consciousness or not? Technically not, so your fasting should not be, I mean, technically, if you're, well, anesthesia is a bit different. That's kind of like sleeping, because you're still, I wouldn't think anesthesia falls under being unconscious. I mean, you technically are, but I think the two would be different. That is a good question. Yeah, Wallahu alam, I haven't really thought about that situation yet, like about what happens if you are under anesthesia. Does that, you're considered being unconscious or are you considered asleep?
In the perspective of you can't be woken up,
Yeah.
you cannot be woken up. If you wake up under anesthesia, that's a massive lawsuit against the hospital.
Oh.
Typically speaking, I mean, we do surgery under
Yeah.
anesthesia. You're not waking up when someone's cutting open your chest.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's,
Wallahu alam,
yeah, I would think that would fall under unconscious more than, it's not an average day you go to sleep and somebody's just splitting open your chest,
I remember when we had one of the core academies with Southern here with Ramadan, one of the partial requirements of fasting was consciousness.
Yeah.
Like a conscious being.
Yeah, so like I said, it all depends on how you're defining anesthesia. You're right, it sounds more like being unconscious than it is that. So if you're, if this is saying, what's the word, intubation, that means you're unconscious, then yeah, your fasting is broken. All right, the next one. It reads like bronchitis, but it's something completely different. Bronchoalveolarlavage. This is like a spelling bee at this point. Whatever that is, just rest assured, your fast is gone. Just ask your doctor, like, if I can't spell it, then just tell me and I'll just do my fast all over again. Well, the way he describes over here, the procedure involved the insertion of a lubricated yeah, whatever that is, right? Through the mouth or nose and the lung. What is that? Yeah, except there's one extra part to it. Okay. All L-A-V-A-G. Oh, L-A-V-A-G-E. After that, there's lavage.
Oh, I see.
Bronchoalveolar. So they stick a tube down your throat and then flush saline into it. So
Yeah.
inserting water into your.
All right, there you go. You heard it. Uh-huh.
Oh, they.
Even if you could hear it, I don't think we would understand it anyway. So like, no, just a simple principle. If you cannot spell it, it breaks your fast. Just go with that, and I think you guys are going to be perfectly fine. I just want to go over this hadith. It's a very inspirational hadith for me when I think about not only fasting but other actions that we do. The hadith is recorded in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim. عن عبد الله بن عمرو رضي الله تعالى عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال الصيام والقرآن يشفعان للعبد يوم القيامة يقول الصيام أي ربي منعته الطعام والشهوات بالنهار فشفعني فيه ويقول القرآن منعته النوم بالليل فشفعني فيه قال فيشفعان. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, he narrates that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, the act of fasting and the Quran on the day of judgment will intercede for a person. The fast will say, O my Lord, I deprived him from food and desires during the day, so accept my intercession for him. The Quran will say, I deprived him from sleep during the night, so accept my intercession for him. And their intercession will be accepted. This is very powerful because nowadays when we do something, we can't really see them. They don't have a form. But on the day of judgment, we learn from a number of hadith that all our actions will take a form. And it will take a form to come and protect us, to come and do shafa'ah on our behalf. The Quran and both fasting. Fasting will say, I made him go through difficulty or her through difficulty in the day, so alleviate half of the difficulty. And then the Quran will say, he recited me at night and that kept him awake. The idea of the Quran in this context oftentimes refers to either a person reading the Quran or even in Taraweeh, where the Quran is being recited, where you could go to sleep but you decide not to sleep and you continue reading or listening to the Quran. These two will intercede on your behalf. And it's fascinating because you'll see some people in the past, they couldn't wrap their heads around these hadith, and they were saying, what does it mean for actions to take a form? Actions are abstract things. How do they take a form? And nowadays, there are so many things and concepts and ideas, things we couldn't gauge in the past, but now we can actually gauge it. We can gauge temperature. We can figure out things that in the past never had a form. Allah can give it a form. So just imagine a person spends their entire life dedicated for Allah, and then when they go to the afterlife, they're never alone. Literally, their actions will take a form and will come and protect them. In some hadith, we learn that Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Ali Imran will take the form of birds, and they will give you shade. Literally, just think about how amazing that is, that all your deeds will take the form of something that you need. It will either aid you, assist you, it will be a light, it will give you shade, and every one deed that you did, you can recognize its form in the Day of Judgment. So don't ever think you're doing something and it's gone. It's being recorded and it will take on an entire form and preserve us. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Before we conclude, just a few things and then we can open it up for Q&A. There's a lot to discuss about both the word fiqh and Ramadan. Last night, we spoke about the introduction to Islamic law, just to get a quick glimpse into the mind of a scholar and see the different considerations they have to take and make when they want to issue a ruling. Then we went through some of the fada'il just to inspire us. And then we went through the specifics of the Fiqh of Ramadan. If you found the material slightly complex or difficult, don't worry at all. This is meant to be just an introduction. Take away the basics that you're aware of, and if you're still confused or you're not sure, just ask a scholar, because this is the job of the scholar to do, to answer the questions. But hopefully, the small time we had together, we're able to just appreciate the nuances of Islam, the complexity of law formation, and how it's not a simple yes or no. As we can tell so many times when we're trying to figure something out, it boils down to definitions. It's not like, oh, the asthma pump should completely be fine. Well, if you're saying that, what's your definition of a throat? What's your definition of particles? What's your definition of a type of gas? So these are questions that scholars have to answer. And wherever you fit on the spectrum of strictness or laxity, the one thing we should all learn is to respect people who hold other opinions. Difference of opinion was always meant to be here to accommodate, not to divide. Oh, that masjid does this, or this person does that. Use that as a pedestal to kind of form bonds. But the one caveat here is, whenever a difference of opinion does occur, it should at least be within the broad spectrum of acceptability. It should be something that scholars vouch for. It's not just something somebody invented or pulled out of a hat. There should be some legitimate grounds on which they issue that ruling. If you want to know more about the Fiqh of Ramadan, obviously Ustadh Amir is always around to help. But yeah, that's just a quick overview. I think, what time is it? It's 3:15ish. Class is officially done in 1 minute. If anybody does need to leave, y'all can leave. I'll take 15 minutes of Q&A until 3:30. Whatever questions you guys have, feel free, one by one we'll do it. But if you need to trickle out, feel free to go ahead. Don't worry about it, inshallah.
One request I have before you do continue.
Yeah.
When somebody asks a question, just for the sake of the
Okay.
recording, if you can repeat the question.
Sure. We're just 9 hours late with that, but we had 9 hours of questioning, and unfortunately they're not here. But yes, let's go ahead.
We were just going over our notes from yesterday during the Dhuhr prayer, and we were trying to match our notes on which sunnah did you prioritize, and we ended up having two different, I don't know if, I think we didn't hear it right or something.
Sure.
But did you, from someone, one of my friends said that you said the two sunnah before Dhuhr were prioritized more, or from what I heard was it was four sunnah
So you can either pray, some would say 2 and 2, but it has to be 4.
Okay.
So the 2 before Fajr is the most important. It's in a category and league on its own. Then it's 4 before Dhuhr, and then 2 after Dhuhr.
I think it was the Dhuhr part that we were, because someone was saying, no, the 2 before Dhuhr is what was the most prioritized one. And I was like, no, it's the 4. So we
Yeah, so both are fine, but 4 is better and more prioritized. Yeah.
It was 4.
It was 4, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like you won that bet, whatever that was.
We were just like,
I'm joking. I'll take a question from this side, yeah.
In regards to kaffarah, and then relating it back to the hadith where Prophet had stated that whoever breaks the fast during Ramadan without an amount of illness, not even continuous daily fasting can make it up. How do we kind of categorize kaffarah along with that? Is that if we miss the fast, even if we give kaffarah, it's not then going to be accepted, or?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question properly.
So the concept of kaffarah, if you like miss
Yeah.
intentionally break your fast
Yeah.
during the month of Ramadan, you have to give the kaffarah.
Yeah.
And you also have to make up the day of fasting.
Sure.
In the hadith, not even continuous daily fasting
Will make up the reward of it. So the question is, if somebody breaks their fast intentionally, they do a kafara, a penalty. We learn from the hadith, when you don't fast one day, it can never compensate, no matter how many days you fast, the loss of reward. That's true if the person intentionally breaks their fast with no excuse. The kafara is not to give them back the reward, but to offset the sin in what they did. Because intentionally breaking the fast is undermining the sanctity of the month of Ramadan. If I had an excuse and I did it, I will get that full reward because it's because of an excuse that I'm doing it. So the kafara doesn't give you that full reward, it just offsets the drawbacks of not fasting. Yes? Oh yeah, we didn't get a chance to touch on that. So what is kafara? Kafara is, there are actually 3 options, but only 2 of them are applicable today, so I'll talk about these 2. Your first option is you have to fast 60 consecutive days. 60 days consecutively. And if for any reason, a medical reason particularly, you can't fast 60 days, your next option is to feed either 60 people or feed 1 person for 60 days. So these are the 2 options that you have. It's more like one after the other. First you have to try to fast 60 days consecutively. If you can't do that, then obviously you have feeding the people. Yes, sister in the back. Yeah.
So when it comes to so when you're making up the days of your period, are you able to do a dual intention on Mondays and Thursdays, or particularly the Shawwal?
Good question. So if somebody is fasting and they're making up their fast because they were on their period and they couldn't fast, can they make both intentions? Let's say 6 days of Shawwal or the 3 days of Ayyamul Bid. You can, but the way it works is your primary intention is the Qada, and you will get the reward because you happen to be doing it on the day. Don't make your primary intention the sunnah. Your primary intention is to make up the fast. Yes.
So I think this is the second traveling from this hadith, but it talks about making up fast from previous Ramadan, and it says that he should fast the current Ramadan and make up the previous one after it. So does that mean when I'm making up my fast, the initial 7 days would be with the intention of making it up from the Ramadan that just passed, and then I'd move on to?
Very good question. When you're making up fast, you cannot use the days of Ramadan. Making up fast has to be outside. Yeah, so I'm just bringing that clarification first, that in Ramadan, you can't make the intention of Ramadan as well as the make-up fast. It has to be outside Ramadan. Once you do it outside Ramadan, it's fully up to you how you want to do it. Do you want to do this month or the previous month? There's an ideal way of doing it. You want to make sure whatever you just missed out, you finish that. But however you spread it out, it's perfectly up to you. Yes. I see your hand. I'll get to you, inshallah. Yeah.
You said that fasting is conscious, right? You said
Yeah.
What if you're sleepwalking and then you just drink water or eat some food?
That's a good situation. Honestly, it doesn't break your fast. If you're sleepwalking and, that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala feeding you, I guess so, right? But the question then is, how do you know? Are you really sleepwalking, or you're you just wake up in the middle? You had your hand up? Yeah.
So like for example, I have allergies, and so like sometimes my throat will like start bleeding because it's irritated. Would that count as like something that's like going to break my fast?
That's interesting, right? Like, in general circumstances, if a person starts to, okay, question. If a person bleeds and then they swallow that blood for whatever reason, does it break their fast or not? Two things to bear in mind. Number one is, if it's internal, you'd have to look at the amount. You'd have to look at the amount, how much is being swallowed, if it's a lot. But if it's in the throat, you're talking about in the throat, then no, that's fine. That's considered internal. Anything past the throat, however we're defining that, but past that area is considered internal. If there's a cut in my mouth or a cut in my tongue, if I bite my tongue and then it's bleeding, that's considered external. And then whenever I swallow that blood, if it's a significant amount. Now, what's considered a significant amount? You don't want to get too much into specifics, but if you swallowed more than like a small amount, then that's going to break your fast. Yes?
Going back to the question about like the dual intention of Ramadan, specifically with Shawwal, the 6 days of Shawwal, I was always under like the pressure of the Fiqh, that's what I heard, that you should fast Ramadan first and then follow it with the Shawwal.
Yeah. That's actually what people say, that you should fast your Qada separately and do the Nafl separately or the Shawwal separately to get that full reward. But in the end of the day, if somebody just finds it difficult to make up so many, if they go with that opinion, that's why I phrased it as your intention is the makeup fast, but since you happen to be fasting that time, we're hopeful that you will get the reward.
And then a follow-up as well, so like, let's say like the day of Arafah, you're fasting food, but I don't, like, would you be able to say like, oh, like, I want to make up the day of Ramadan?
You can, that's fine. Like I said, but remember, the primary intention is always making up. Will you get that reward? We're hopeful, but it's very different. The person who does it solely on that day will definitely get more reward. Okay.
How can I avoid taking riba when getting a loan?
Okay.
I don't understand like the profit aspect, and then them like them upcharging.
So the thing about a loan is you can take a loan that has no interest. Like if you're talking about in the modern day, like normal financial institutions, it's very tough to take a loan. That's why they go through Islamic loans and Islamic financing. So it's a bit of a tangent, but the way Islamic financing works, it's more, they use the language that's conventional banking, but the actual contracts and the agreements are very different. The difference between an interest-bearing loan and what happens in a lot of Islamic finance contexts, what they call diminishing musharaka, is one is a partnership and one is a pure loan. So when I get a home and I go to a bank and I need, let's say, $500,000, I put a down payment of $200,000 and I'm borrowing $300,000. That $300,000 that I'm borrowing from them, in the end of the life of the loan, I may be paying them $350,000, and they're using that language. But here's the difference. The way the contract is actually formed is, I'm not borrowing $300,000 from them and buying the house with my $500,000. What's happening is, I'm putting $200,000, they're putting $300,000, and we buy the house as partners. Once we buy the house as partners, given that I am benefiting from the house, I pay an additional amount for my rent or for my stay. That's kind of like how they frame it. And yeah, that's basically how you can do it. And that's a different subject altogether about Islamic finance, but hopefully that should give some context to it. Yes?
Might be a stupid question, but do you know what the main reason is for fasting to be kind of more strict than prayer? Like, for example, for prayer, you can't do the prayer as it is. You can do it in different ways according to your ability. Why is fasting different? Like, for example, if you have to take medication, you kind of just break your fast. You can't just fast to the best of your ability.
Very good question. Like, why is it that it seems fasting is more strict in terms of its rules than prayer? It has to do with defining the essential components of each. What are the bare bones essential components of fasting, and what are the bare bones essential components of praying? You put the two together. In prayer, they've determined that X, Y, and Z are the most important things. Once you miss out on those things, your prayer no longer exists. So if you're standing, if you can't stand, you can sit down. Does that remove an integral component of my prayer? No, it does not. But let's say, for instance, I'm paralyzed and I can't move at all. Can I pray with my eye movements? And the scholars say, no, you can't, because the integral components of prayer are now officially gone. In fasting, the integral component is no akal, no drinking, and no intercourse. Now, the definition of eating is very precise. And because it's quicker and easier to lose that definition, it seems like it's more stricter. It's just the essential components are so tied into fasting that it seems like anything you do will undermine it. But if you think about it more broadly, it's kind of like, okay, I'm fasting and I take an IV drip. Well, it doesn't break my fast. Wait, but doesn't that no, but it didn't break the essential components of fasting. Well, a person has a wet dream, for instance. It doesn't break the fast. Wait, but doesn't that look similar to, like, no, but it didn't break the fast. The essential components were not met. Because it kind of works both ways if you think about it. There are a number of things that a person's allowed while they're fasting that they're not allowed while they're praying. So for instance, if a person forgetfully breaks their wudu in salah, it doesn't matter, their salah is broken. But while I'm fasting, if I forgetfully eat, it's perfectly fine. Do you understand? It's just what we've covered made it seem like that. Yes?
And I know you kind of went over this, but I missed part of it. So if a woman is pregnant, well, let's say like she just had a baby, and then Ramadan, like during Ramadan or right before, there's a long period of time where maybe the woman can't pray after giving birth. She can't fast. She misses an entire month, right? So she has to make up that entire month.
According to the majority of scholars, she has to make up that entire month whenever she has the opportunity in the future. A question, well, let me repeat the question. The question is, if somebody's expecting and then they're unable to fast in the month of Ramadan, do they have to make up the entire month? And the answer is yes, according to majority of scholars you do. Some scholars say if you just give fidya and you just pay for that month, it's sufficient. But that's a minority opinion that if a scholar goes with, I respect that opinion, but I'm just stating what the majority have to say about it. Yeah.
Just to tag on to the end of that as well, does that also apply then to the prayer? Are they also required to make up all the prayers they missed during the time of, for instance,
Well, pray if they're on their period or their fasting, prayer.
Period and postpartum.
Well, in the case of postpartum and period, they don't have to pray. There's no qada for it. There's nothing. It's only qada of fasting. Yes.
So going back to that hadith real quick about on eating first on the Day of Judgment.
Yeah.
So it says it's going to say I deprived him of sleep during the night. Does that encompass like all aspects of Quran, whether we're listening to it inside of Ramadan, outside of Ramadan?
Yeah. Absolutely, everything. Yes.
You mentioned it earlier, but I just wanted to refresh that if a person is traveling, it's not the same as the traveling done from our ancestors where they were on camelback in the scorching sun. Now we're mostly on like first class.
I don't know about mostly. We're mainly on economy. Maybe you can speak for yourself when you talk about first class.
So most of us are in economy, and some of us are in first class or air conditioning and things like that. We recommend to fast, but now sub that.
You're going to talk about prayer?
No.
Okay.
The question is, you're basically like following the sun or going away from the sun.
Yeah.
Two questions. One, do you break your fast where you originally left, or do you break your fast where you're going? Do you break your fast midair?
Okay, so here's a question. Basically, if I'm traveling, let's say I'm flying from Dallas and then I'm going to Saudi or somewhere, forget about if this is a factual scenario or not, the directions may not work out. But let's say, for instance, I begin my fast and now I'm traveling. As I'm traveling, where in Dallas, it's already been sunset, so they're breaking the fast. But as I'm traveling, like, let's just say the sun is going alongside with me. Like, it's been like 10 hours and the sun still hasn't set. What do I do? There's actually a specific scenario where this happens. I forget the country. I can't remember exactly, but that happens. Like, as they're going with the sun, so they have never reached the point of sunset. What do you do? And the answer to this, and there's no right answer per se, but the answer many scholars have gone with is, it depends on how long your fast has been prolonged. You do not go with where you initially started your fast. Technically speaking, you're meant to go with wherever you are at the moment. So, as long as your fasting is less than 24 hours, you go with wherever you are. So, if it's already been sunset in Wisconsin, but where I'm flying over, it's still sunrise, then I am not allowed to break my fast. But then like 6 hours later, I reach a point of sunset, now I'm allowed to break my fast. But now here's the thing. What happens if I'm carrying on and the sun still hasn't set? And it's been like 20 hours, 21 hours, 22 hours. I'm waiting for the sunset, but the sun is like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm following you around as I'm going. What happens then? So as you're going, the scholars say the cutoff point is 24 hours. The moment you hit the 24-hour mark, you're allowed to just break. It's actually 23 hours and a half for a specific reason, but let's just say 24 hours, you're allowed to break your fast. Alhamdulillah. I mean, you're talking about, what's that thing called, something G, when you're not eating for 3 days? What was that thing? Autophagy. Man, you guys are talking about autophagy. You're not eating for what, 3 days straight or 7 days straight. So yeah, I mean, 24 hours shouldn't be too much of an issue.